examination. And there is something I wanted to say to you about that. If you go back to the apology, which few people, I don't think it seems philosophical. It's not very philosophical, but in there he says one thing, that lets you, that I think indicates that he did have a bit of, there's some things that are absolutely true. Because one of the things he says is, no one will ever convince me that it is better to do evil than to suffer evil. And he says that, as firmly as he says anything. So Socrates does have real beliefs. He's not just, in the dialogues, he questions a lot of people in order to show the reader their character. Since character is one thing, and those are not syllogisms. Those are interviews or interrogations.
Sounds like a choir boy to me.
Choir boy, huh?
Yeah, Socrates. I can see the Christian connection there.
Yeah.
I heard about it.
So are real beliefs the same as real knowledge, though? I could firmly believe in something and committed to it. Okay, you're committed.
Well, there is in one of the other dialogues, and I can't think of where it is. Maybe in the Republic, but he makes there's a long argument about doing evil versus suffering evil, where he concludes that the bad man cannot harm the good man because suffering evil never harms the good man. Therefore, the good.
I think he needs a course of, not leeches, but some postmodernism to help sort him out.
What?
I guess I'm not a good man because when I suffer evil, I actually suffer evil. So I don't know. It does really hurt.
Well, he doesn't say it doesn't physically hurt. He says it doesn't destroy your soul.
Yeah.
And your knowledge of the good,
Well, I have not gone into psychosis yet, but neurosis, yes, maybe. We all suffer from neurosis.
I just wanted to say that some people, and that's kind of, that Socrates is always ironic, or either he doesn't believe in anything or something. I think he has some ideas of what better answers to questions are. But at the same time, I think he also says you can't memorize the answers. That if philosophy is not memorized answers to a multiple choice test, surely we've gotten beyond that, Phil. You exhibit great subtlety in your arguments frequently.
So are you saying that I've lost my memory?
No, Phil. I think I said one time, they're too old now, but I would trust you to raise my children because I know you wouldn't teach them anything wrong or bad or to do evil. You ought to, there is this book by Walter Kaufman, a critique. I think it's a critique of religion and philosophy, where he actually talks about Socrates, Jesus, and Buddha in a very, very interesting. It's also incredibly funny. It's one of those books that's full of those, bilingual puns and crap like that nobody ever gets. But it's an interesting book on, if you read that book, I would say you can live a better life, if not a good life, by picking numerous people, among those three. You could pick any one. And none of them ever wrote a word. Makes you, so enough.
I don't think that's enough. That's awesome. I'm now looking for a critique of religion and philosophy.
I think that's the title of it, but
that's it. That's the title.
But yeah, I got looking through my books. I'm still trying to find the book on Greek archaeology, the stuff they did. Yeah. And I found I own like three copies of Kaufman's critique of it's like every time I see it, I say, well, somebody that doesn't appreciate this might buy it. I should own it or something.
Yeah. Well, why don't we steer ourselves toward our agenda and some text? For those just joining us, hi Dave. We're part of a long-running Kenneth Smith philosophy seminar, which we've been doing for, at this point, oh God, I don't know, 200 sessions so far. We're 85 into this series on Millennia and Microcosm when we had others before that. Maybe it's only 150. I could be exaggerating. It'll be 200 before long. I can tell you that much. So in this current arc, Millennia and Microcosm, we're working our way through an unpublished book by Kenneth Smith. Its content has been published, but not in book form. It was published as a series of installments of a magazine column, and the column was called End Times. It was published in, of all places, the Comics Journal, a magazine that tries to treat comic books as serious art and do serious criticism of them, from a storytelling and art perspective and so on. And what he was doing in the back, of the Comics Journal is a long story for another time. But he was putting out those installments in 1998, 99, and 2000. And he was using the turn of the millennium as an opportunity to review previous millennia, looking at 3 different epochs of European history. And of course, the most recent epoch, modernism, has become the epoch of the whole world because modernity is all about spreading. So this book is an exercise in trying to understand the modernist worldview by comparing and contrasting it with the medieval worldview and the ancient worldview. So the book starts by taking us back to the ancient worldview. And what he's trying to do is not caricature the ancients. He's not trying to depict them the way that moderns imagined them to be. He's trying to identify how they see the world from their own perspective, not from our perspective. And he'll do the same in the following chapters with the medieval worldview. And the goal is that by the time he gets to the last third of the book, which talks about modernity, we come into looking at our own time and our worldview and our presuppositions with new eyes, able to say, what would the medievals have said about these things we take for granted? What would the ancients have said about these things we take for granted? So we're 85 into them. The first few were about the opening introductions, but we've been on chapter 4 most of this time. Part of the reason is that chapter 4, he does in one chapter what for each of the other epochs takes a whole bunch of chapters. He's basically compressing, everything that he's got to say here about the ancient worldview into a set of lettered sections, all within chapter 4. So I'm just going to drop those section names in here.
Hey, Rick, could I just say something quick?
Yeah.
If we've been at it about 3 years, and you have average attendance of, let's say, 10 people, okay, average. We've aged 30 years. Have we learned anything, or have we just grown wiser by the fact that we spent 30 years at this?
I think we've made some real progress. And part of it is, for the first epoch especially, it's very hard for us to figure out what it means to disengage ourselves from the modern worldview. We're so used to it being impossible to look at the world any other way than the way we've been marinating in for decades. That as we look at each of these lettered sections has a certain number of kind of core conceptions of the self, the sacred, and nature that are just deeply alien to the way moderns see the world. They're not primitive versions of the modern world, the way that moderns like to imagine. They're actually an alternative perspective that has its own strengths and weaknesses, independent of our desire to turn them into a stepping stone that leads to us. And getting to where these core ideas where we can accept the idea that it's possible for somebody to think differently than we do without being inferior to us, it takes time. It's really hard to do. The hardest was section F. We spent a long time on section F because to a modern, a myth is a lie. Right off the bat, a myth means it's a popular story, but it's absolutely false. And we might say that a myth is primitive science. We might say it's entertainment for the masses in the ancient days. We have a number of things that we categorize myths as, but the reflex to read a myth as a falsehood is so strong that we could go through a whole session where we had explored the way that the ancients absolutely did not see a myth that way. They saw myths as a completely different kind of thing. It's very important to the ancient world. We'd all be okay, we've got it. Then we come back next week and we're right back to thinking that a myth is a falsehood. It's just that it was so hard for us to be able to stick on that idea that the ancients saw it differently and to be able to shift back and forth smoothly between them. But I think we're mostly there at this point. And so we're into section G, character and class. And this is the most controversial of the sections in chapter 4, because this is exploring the ancient belief that people are not equal. And core to the idea that people are not equal, for us as moderns, the assumption is that if people are different, then they must be organized into a stratum of better and worse, right? Everything to us is linear and mechanical. So we can't hear the concept that people aren't equal to each other without thinking, well, which one is better and which one is worse? And then we say, well, this is a dangerous idea, because if you say some people are worse, then of course we're going to, treat them very badly. So everybody has to be equal to justify being treated with human dignity, or else evil and chaos is unleashed upon the world. And we don't see how, in reading it that way, it's our own modernist tendency to dominate others and to look for weakness and to might makes right. Is this ever running nihilist thread right under the surface of modernity that we don't like to talk about? But to the ancients, diversity wasn't a threat and it wasn't a sign of inferiority. It was what you wanted. You wanted people with diverse skills. You wanted some people to be artists. You wanted some people to be philosophers. You wanted some people to be great builders of houses. You wanted a wide variety of skills so that people could cultivate those skills and then use them for the service of, the community. The community is enriched by diversity, in the ancient Greek worldview. And that's why when the Greeks would encounter a different culture that had a different religion, they didn't do what the medievals did, and they didn't do what we did. They didn't set out to exterminate them. Right? We're always about converting everybody else. We must eliminate all of their religions or worldviews except for ours, because ours is right and everybody else is wrong. This is like 1,000 years of the medieval epoch has built into us this idea that everybody's organized into better and worse, and the worse must be replaced with the better. So it's really difficult for us to believe, even despite endless amounts of evidence, it's very difficult for us to believe that the ancient Greeks didn't commit pogroms and genocide on the basis of religion. But they didn't. And neither did the Romans, right? The Romans would conquer. They're as conquest-oriented and imperial as we can imagine, but still, when they would conquer an area, instead of trying to eliminate the religions that were there, or tell them, oh, you must convert or die, which the medievals would do, instead, they said, tell us about your gods. We want to learn about them, and we're going to build temples to your gods. Maybe you know things about the cosmos we don't know. We'll share, and our religion will grow, and it'll become larger. You see this in the Library of Alexandria in the Hellenistic period, when there is a lot of work being done to compare Hermes and Thoth, for example, and other kinds of. They're looking for what the relationships are between the religions to try to spot innovations that they don't have, so that they can bring them in. So it's hard for us to really buy that the Greeks and Romans were like that, because that doesn't fit into our great march of progress in which everybody in the past is worse than we are, and we're the best of the best and the smartest and the most scientific and objective and free and everything else, right? That's our lottery. By being born moderns, we win the lottery, and we're absolutely free and scientific. It's hard for us to believe that somebody in the past might have had reflexive behavior based on their worldview that was, in some ways, sure, it could be inferior, but in other ways, it could be superior. Not just an alternative, but, living up to things that we wish we lived up to, but don't. So this idea of diversity being acknowledged as a real thing in human beings, and a good thing, a desirable thing, nature abhors a monoculture. We want people to develop different skills. All of this has been, built up in the previous sections, A through F, and G is where it bears fruit in the really controversial idea that the Greek class system, however it originated, which is a separate story, was being justified during the 500s and 400s and 300s BCE, was being justified based on this model of human behavior and human character, that there is this diversity, it needs to be protected and encouraged, and that the purpose of society and education is not to homogenize everybody and pretend that we're all equal. The purpose is to find out what everybody's gifts are and then to help them cultivate them for the good of humanity. This is pretty central to the Greeks. Would fight about a lot of different things, but some of this stuff they wouldn't fight about that we would assume that they would fight about. So we're now on paragraph 4. We finished paragraphs 1 through 3. Let me just drop the link into the chat for those who want to. It was also in the invite at Meetup, but that's the link to the essay. So you can go there and scroll your way down to section G and go to paragraph 3, and that's where we're picking up. We're going to wrestle with these ideas of character and class. And I'll put the text of paragraph 4 in a moment, but first Phil would like to say something. So tell us what's on your mind, Phil.
Yeah, I kind of agree with what you're saying, but when you said that way in terms of diversity, embedded within that it's actually a tremendous criticism of Hegel, because of Hegel as storytelling, the narrative is the march of history, and particularly when you focus on Western history. I mean, let's not criticize all the variations, but it only went in one direction. It's almost as if you build a city, you only build one road out of town. I mean, like, shouldn't there be like multiple roads that reach north, south, east, west, northeast, southwest? I mean, like, you see what I'm saying? It's like by just focusing on the story of a one-directional road, it seems like a lot of stuff is left out. Now, I realize that he does not totally cancel anything, negate them. He just sort of sublimate them in a lesser role. So in some senses, so they could reoccur again. But I just wonder, and maybe maybe the age of exploration that allows at least contact with other civilizations, even be it having some negatives, actually open up the possibility that, oh, wait a minute, we might have gone this way, I mean, and we might have been China, we've gone this way, we might have been like the South Pacific, it just seemed like, yeah, the one story. I mean, it's kind of like seeing, these movies, they have sequels and they keep building on it. It's like you want to see a different movie, but it's like, it's like movie 2, movie 3, movie 4. I mean, it's the same damn thing. And so I wonder whether there's not a problem in that. I mean, yeah, we're trapped. Like, that's all the theaters are showing. You either go to movie 10 or you don't go to the movies.
Right.
So that's a really heavy duty criticism of Hegel, in spite of the fact that I like Hegel, but wow. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. There's a lot to admire in Hegel, but like anybody else, he had his major blind spots, and one of them was he was, although Martin Luther would have called him a heretic on the basis of his beliefs, Hegel and Goethe both were devout Lutherans, and Hegel in particular wanted to reinterpret all of history as a great march of progress that led to Lutheranism, in which as he says, and this is where you can see the kind of genocidal concept of the world that we inherited out of the medieval epoch into the modern epoch. Hegel argues pretty much straightforward in the Philosophy of Geist. I mean, I translated these passages a couple months ago and was shocked and went back and double checked. It's like, yep. He said that, freedom didn't exist for most people. And so 400,000 years of human existence, he thinks most of them were never free. And he says the Greeks stumbled upon the idea of freedom, but they weren't fully free because they hadn't found Jesus yet. Only with Jesus can you be absolutely free. And that's why Lutheranism is the highest form of religion, because finally people can be free. And, that is Augustine's argument in a nutshell, although shifted out of Catholicism into Lutheranism. The argument that for there to be freedom or peace on earth or any other good thing, we have to exterminate all other religions. We have to convert everybody to our way of seeing the world because diversity is threatening and inferior. Everything is inferior that doesn't lead directly to the one truth that we coincidentally happen to be in possession of. So here's Hegel in the middle of Philosophy of Geist, when he's introducing these core ideas. He's citing the oracle at Delphi, know thyself. He's talking about the difficulties of ideological thinking. He's got all the tools and he's proficient with them, but he's so busy applying them against other people's philosophies and ideas that he's doing an inadequate job of applying them against his own philosophies and ideas. And as a result, he subscribes to the Great March of Progress, which is a genocidal idea. And he doesn't see the problem. He can't see that he's a captive of an ideology, which he happens to be an expert on, the problems of ideology in that era. He just wrote, Phenomenology of Geist and Philosophy of Geist. Nobody's better positioned than he is to go, hey, wait a minute, what's going on in my brain? I seem to be like Procrustes trying to cram everything into fitting this bed. I wonder if I have a problem. But no, he just passes right by it. And
yeah, unfortunately, the one row leads to Las Vegas.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's a riot. So, and of course, that's when in my translations, I've got notes, where I'm going along trying to say, do I think I have this word right, or is this a German idiom I have to figure out? And when he writes that bit about, but nobody's free but the Christians, I write, oh no, oh Hegel, I'm so disappointed in you, because there's medievalism, right, cropping up centuries after we're into the modern epoch, and it still comes naturally to him to see the world as a great march of progress leading coincidentally to his own religion, which couldn't be further from the Greek conception of religion and the relationships between different religions. And yet he's a great scholar of the Greeks. I mean, he says there's not a single proposition of Heraclitus's that I haven't made central to my own great philosophy, which, I'm trying to convert out of ideology and turn into a science. That's why he keeps talking about these things as being a scientific philosophy. And yet there's an ideology right smack dab in the center of his belief system, right? He's doing it all to try to rationalize his own ideology, without acknowledging that that's what he's doing. I come back to Kenneth Smith loves to quote Kafka, really on a par with Hegel and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and others. He thinks Kafka's just as insightful as those guys are. And he cites Kafka's line, he was permitted to attain the Archimedean standpoint, but only on the condition that he use it against himself. And I always initially, for decades, I thought that Kenneth Smith was quoting that as just sort of I had the pop culture interpretation of Kafka as being perversely negative. And that, the whole reason for that to be there was just, oh, look, Kafka's being Kafka again. But that is absolutely not what he was doing. What he's saying is, you are not a philosopher until you are applying these tools against your own ideologies and belief systems. If all you do is pick up a bunch of tools to wield against other people, you're still an ideologue, because you're not actually challenging the extent to which your own ideologies possess you. And if you're not, then whatever it is you're doing is still completely contained by your noetic demons, if you will. And I didn't understand that for the longest time, that that's what it was about. And now I quote it all the time. I finally see it. There's all these smart people who are interested in philosophy and philosophers and read all this stuff, and yet they never actually question their own beliefs, their current beliefs, at the level of intensity that they do other people's ideas. And that's Hegel's Achilles heel right there, right, in a nutshell. So just as important as an object lesson as he is as a source of wisdom. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, it was a meeting only a few days ago, I think, where somebody was making the quotes that, yes, the Greeks were believing all this nonsense in mythology. And I was sort of pointing, well, the Greeks, of course, had their rational revolution as well, where Kenneth Smith claims in this passage, of course, they reached a point later on of the skeptics and the Stoics and all that, who looked back upon the age that thought Jupiter turned into a swan and seduced maidens, as thinking, well, even the Greeks reached a point where they thought, what were these guys smoking, you know? But actually, I was looking at this guy, TIK History, and he does a World War II blog, quite a lot, actually. And you might enjoy, I put it in the chat. He believes he's come up with a new word, Hegel's idiobabble. And whether you agree with it or disagree with it, it's just fascinating to see somebody who's sort of intelligent, but sort of kicking into some of this stuff at an earlier stage. So he's highly critical of Hegel, and he throws Heraclitus in the same barrel, which is curious. But it's just interesting to see this. Of course, the Bible equates diversity with perversity. It's full of the term divers this and divers that, and this is always something that's bad. But you look at the Hebrew religion, and what was so effective about it in some ways was that they created a uniformity. It was a one-stop religion for all your spiritual needs. Very, very well set up. Of course, you know, if you went to a synagogue in Spain or a synagogue in Greece, things weren't too different. Now, of course, if you're a pagan, you went from one spot to the other. You had to work very hard. So the pagans would try to see a connection. They'll try to see a connection between the cults of the cat goddess in Egypt and Artemis in Greece and the Nordic mysteries of Shady. Apparently, the priestesses of the Nordic mystery, according to legend, came down to the temple of Artemis in some reference back there. And so I'd probably say Hegel, of course, is living within a context. Socrates is living within a context. Their society is a particular type of context. It was a society with a much simpler and firmer set of values than we got today with all our media. Well, I look at the German idealists. I mean, the weirdest thing that would happen in Königsberg is if the cows stopped giving milk and the milkmaidens didn't know what to do. These were very different societies. The interesting thing, it's in these particular sort of societies, they start going over the fine points of ideas to a degree we don't see anywhere else. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, we'll have plenty of opportunities over the course of this book to dig into Hegel and his pros and cons. It's going to be really interesting when we wrap up chapter 4 in, you know, a couple of months. I don't think we're that far away, and start into the chapters that are about the medieval epochs, because that's when we start getting into the nature of the medieval revolution against the ancient world, What was the promise? What was their critique of the ancients? How did they read the failure of the ancient epoch to live up to its promises? And why did they offer what became medievalism as the solution to the problem? Now, all of that's not just their roots, that's our roots too. A recurring theme that we have that's fairly heretical and anathema in the modern world is the idea that moderns are medievals. We're medievals who have made a few changes, and those changes are incredibly important to us, and we think that makes us a completely different people. But we didn't change any of the rest of it. We only changed the things that we spotted, and then followed through the implications of those changes, which did permeate everything. But that's a far cry from critiquing the entire framework of our belief system and saying, I wonder how much of this we should jettison at the same time that we're consciously jettisoning a handful of things. So you see it, in our economics, where we say that we're all about democracy or representative democracy or something like that, but that's not actually how we run our economy. That's still medieval. And as the modern epoch moves on further and further, we find that access to healthcare, education, housing, and everything else increasingly takes on a medieval character. You have to attach yourself to a great lord who is a source of funding and who agrees to share some of that funding with you so that you can rent a life. This is weirdly different from, and yet not entirely unlike, being a serf, where now you can move wherever you want, but it still doesn't change the fact that unless you attach yourself to a source of income, you die, right? You become homeless, you become imprisoned, you go to a mental hospital. Something unpleasant will happen to you in the modern epoch unless you're attached to a lord. But we don't call them lords anymore because, of course, we got rid of all that. So a lot of that comes true in the way that we, in the modern epoch, are so attached to the fallacy of the law of the excluded middle, the fallacy that things can be divided into absolute categories and sorted onto one side or the other of each of those divides, true or false, right? Advanced or primitive, they're objective or subjective. We love to make these little conceptual noetic splits and then sort everything and everybody into these categories, because once we've done that, we can then reason out, we can write laws about people based on which category they fall into, and we can develop our logic about how to make decisions, what our strategy should be based on the properties that we've selected as the important ones for each person. This process of abstraction is related to the medieval process of abstraction, by which everything was sorted into either it's aligned with God and therefore it's good, or it's not aligned with God and therefore it's evil. When Charlemagne, Big Chuck, as as my high school humanities teacher used to translate his name, when Big Chuck got called great, not just because he was a big guy, but because the medieval church loved what he did when he swept across Europe, exterminating pagans and heathens wherever he could find them. He said, the cross or the sword, you choose. Either you convert and go to church, or you die. And meanwhile, I'm going to raid all of your sacred groves and temples and amass enormous piles of gold that have been accumulating for thousands of years in Europe. And now it's all going to be given to the church, and, well, to Charlemagne's own kids too, of course. So this whole idea of, if someone's in a medieval epoch, if someone's a Christian, you owe him Christian brotherhood and kindness and all of these things. But if he's not a Christian, then he should either convert or die. Those are his options. He doesn't get any other options. This is the precursor to the modern obsession with the excluded middle and sorting people into categories. We learned it from 1,000 years of practice. And all we did when we switched over from the medieval epoch to the modern epoch was we removed God as the sorting mechanism, and we replaced it with people, parliaments, economies, whatever we decided were the categories became the categories.
But may I mention that
please.
I like history a bit, and looking at the history of shipbuilding and how the British were running their navy.
Yeah,
this intense practice of categorization really came in around the time of Newton, and it spread like wildfire.
yeah.
They started to categorize every aspect of life. Now, In other words, almost categorizing everything as a proxy word for the Enlightenment, I would say.
Yes.
They thought, oh, look at this schema that we can suddenly position the whole universe and see so far. And there's a degree of truth in that. Now you have the romantic reaction to that sort of dry. It became, for the romantics, the new romantics, an excessively dry way of looking at the world. And of course, they make the point, Goethe and people like Hammond and Herder, that this way of thinking, although it makes great strides, is shallow.
Yes.
This is, again, this warning appears with Nietzsche, where he accuses his fellow academics of being shallow. Now, it was all right. It was all right for the great masses to be shallow. We don't expect that. But the whole point of being an educated man is that you rise a bit above the shallowness.
Right.
And look at what's happened. I was looking at one of the local arguments on postmodernism and what we call the Enlightenment or modernism. And yeah, but in some ways I look and I'm seeing that postmodernism is a continuation of that whole categorization tendency of the Enlightenment. I mean, it's like 50 years ago, there were a few people saying, well, we shouldn't really go around pigeonholing people, And yet right now, in the last 20 years, the universities are pigeonholing people to such an extent into racial groups and sexual orientation. So they had a committee meeting saying no more pigeonholing. And then they went on to introduce such extreme levels of pigeonholing in thought. So, yeah, this is a bit like the committee meeting where they had the problem of two popes, so they ended up electing a third pope.
Right.
So, yeah, I'm starting to wonder now, is in certain sense postmodernism a continuation of the sins of modernism?
Yeah.
But they say, no, we're different, but you're acting the same. You're actually getting worse.
Yes.
And another question which arose was somebody was saying, oh, well, that postmodernism has laid the boot for Christianity or religion. I thought, no, actually, no, because when you say, when they're saying, well, we cannot know what's universally true, we're only talking about man. Religion will love you. You've just said that man cannot know what's universally true. Hey guys, we've got a help for you. We've got this all-powerful God that not only knows what's universally true, it is what's universally true. And so I just sort of struck me the weakness in the logic there that, no, sorry, it was modernism that was laying the boot into religion, that was cutting religion down. You bring in postmodernism where you're saying, well, man really doesn't know what the universal truth is. You suddenly given religion back its role in the car yard. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Hey, Rick, if you're talking to us, we can't hear you.
Yeah, I was sort of talking into the mute, wasn't I? So let me just share that's paragraph 4 there in the text I've put into the chat. We can read that while we're discussing what people have their hands up to talk about. For Dave's benefit, I just want to add that the use of the term modernity here is distinct from the way it's used in art criticism or in other fields. We don't mean the artistic period that's called modernism. Modernity here is drawing from the existentialist tradition where it pretty much refers to everything since the medieval epoch, and it's definitely not over yet. And this is so when Stephen's talking about modernism and postmodernism, he's talking about the way that there is this continuity that is denied by, but nevertheless persists across all of these kind of modernist periods, in which we're constantly trying to define and redefine ourselves, and yet somehow not changing the fundamentals. And I guess the thing that most underscores what Stephen's saying is the explosion of computerization. Computers have no nuance. They can't understand the complexity of things at a qualitative level. They can only understand according to the law of the excluded middle. And so they really demand that people be assigned identifiers and that people be categorized, male versus female. Well, you got to look, my computer only handles those two. You've got to be one or the other. Tell me which one it is so I can get you into the computer, and you see the relationship between computerization and abstraction, most of all in the place where IBM made its big money, which was the Holocaust. Right? That's why people had barcode, why they had numbers on them. Those were the numbers on their punch cards that were being filled out by the clerks of the Holocaust as they were admitting people into the death camps. And all of those things ended up in IBM computers. And IBM made a killing from the Nazis, making money off of categorizing people as not human beings, but as numbers, heights, weights, hair colors, and the other properties that were abstracted out of them. And that would include things like, did the Nazis think that they would work hard and they could get some labor out of them, or did they think that these people were weak and maybe needed to be disposed of? That would all go onto your card, and that card became your identity to the extent to which it determined whether you lived or died. It was all being done on the basis of the law of the excluded middle and on very simple abstract categories by people who thought they were the most scientific and advanced people in the world. I mean, after all, it was the biggest computerization project in history up until that time. So Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I would have been interested in continuing the text, but this discussion has gotten rich enough that I thought I would continue because it seems very interesting. I'm glad you mentioned Charlemagne, because he was the one that united, let's say, the spirit would I guess space or land or whatever you call it. And it seems to me that's always been the problem of the ontological difference, between the ideas. If spirit could be sort of condensed into mind, and mind could be condensed into concepts, then you have ideas versus, real things in a sense. And what your comment about Charlemagne, it just brought into the relationship that the unity of the church to property as the lords and the medieval lords is an important conjunction, because that formed the basis of the existential condition. And it seems to me when modernity happened, I mean, philosophical modernity, let's say beginning, with capitalism and let's say the Enlightenment, is that, capital began to, in a sense, be the structure, because, when the revolution of, let's say, sort of the beginning of democracy happened, it seemed like it was the middle class, and I mean by middle class in that sense, the landed gentry, who defined what property was. And John Locke, who is a hero of mine in a way, but he sort of said, that's a very important element of I guess a structure of civilization. And his fundamental argument was that, yeah, the Indians live on the land and they move through the land, but they never work the land. Now, maybe work was a little bit loosely defined there, and so they never owned the land. And that is part of the reason why we have the right to work the land and own it and actually turn it into a capital structure. And in some sense, that is the state of what capitalism is. is owning property, and in a sense, therefore, distributing property so that there's a relationship between property and labor. And so, of course, that comes in with Marx. And in a sense, there's a reason, I guess, economists and a financial expert, and he was the Greek financial minister during the collapse of the Greek economy. And he seemed like a very smart guy, and he says something very strange. Some people, not strange. I actually like what he says, but a lot of people refutes him. And he says, capitalism itself is dead. He says what replaced it is something much worse. He called it techno-feudalism. He give the example of Amazon and any of these major corporations in a sense. Amazon doesn't produce anything. It's not a capitalist. They do not do anything. What they do is they herd capitalists together and rent them digital space so that they could collect rent from the digitization of capital. So that's why you go in there. They don't do anything except rent space in the cloud, because that's how Amazon gets his profit, getting a cut of what the capitalists actually produce by working the workers and labor. So they produce goods, but the goods now have another layer, which is the digital cloud. Now you could in a sense, go against that and open your storefront in the middle of Iowa, and nobody's going to go there. They might go to Walmart, which also is a cloud capital, because they have a capital mark. I mean, a digital storefront as well as a physical storefront. And so now everybody's rushing into this digital landscape of profit. But if you go to any small town in the Midwest or anywhere else, they're all falling apart because they can't make it. They can't compete against the cloud distribution of goods. And of course, like as Amazon doesn't do, he said that is digitization of feudalism, because the property is no longer land, but the cloud. So that is very, very interesting. The transformation of that thing from a physical space into production capital, now finally become a kind of ethereal cloud space. and that's why he says, capitalism is dead, because they are now actually the medium producers that, in a sense, cloud has herded together. So that's a very interesting transformation that has something to do with technology, like the Industrial Revolution was a technological progress that allowed for the distribution of goods and capital in existential world. And now we have Amazon and Walmart and all sorts of, and I'm sure, like, Apple is collects rent. You could be a person who develop an app, but you put it on an Apple, they're going to charge you. They're going to get a cut. So there you go. How modernity has put us in this physical space. Think about Facebook now, I guess, Meta. I mean, you go on there, your eyeballs is paying the rent for somebody who's trying to capture your eyeball, and they're collecting money. That's it, Phil. Very, very.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, there's just like there's so many different ways to define, the economy or to define the modern epoch. There's plenty of different ways in which people want to draw the lines and say, now it's over. Now we've come to the end of history. Now that part is done. But using the existentialist definitions that Kenneth Smith is working with, it is the abstractivizing itself that is the signature of modernity. And moving from a physical storefront to a digital storefront is definitely abstracting. I mean, I've been programming for 40 years, and we couldn't do it at all if it weren't for abstraction. Even something as with as concrete and intense real world consequences as medical software is still absolutely dependent upon how it translates the concrete patient into the abstract patient who's in the medical record. And so, the shift from, the robber baron era of the 19th century of, who's cutting down the most trees, or who's squatting on the land that the railroads need to go through, or what have you, that's building up these giant fortunes. The modern version of it, where if you want access to the new abstract world of the cloud, then you have to pay rent to the abstract landlords who stand between you and access to the digital heaven that we all want to flee into. It's just another version of the same economy. You can see it as well in the enormous amount of upset when we disconnected the dollar from the gold standard. And for some people, that was the line they couldn't stand. It's like, oh, now it's not real. It's like, well, I don't know how to break it to you, but it wasn't real before that either. I mean, the largest piles of gold were in the hands of the medieval nobility, right? That had carried over from the previous epoch, and the whole reason for disconnecting from the gold standard was to pull the fangs of the nobility, who in the modern world still had disproportionate influence because they were sitting on big piles of gold. And the moment gold doesn't matter, and that's just another commodity like any other commodity, and the dollar's disconnected from them, the power of the nobility, was at least cut in half, maybe more, thus allowing, the modern economy to abstract itself even further from its original power structure. So I think the shift into the digital world is, I think Kenneth would say it's very interesting, and there's a lot to be explored in it. It might be a new stage of modernity, but it's not different from modernity. It's not the end of capitalism or anything like that. It's, if anything, the thing that happens over the course of an epoch is whatever its core ideas are become purified over the course of the epoch as it sheds the accoutrements of the previous epoch increasingly. There is this way in which, in the early and middle stages of an epoch, the members of that epoch don't understand it. What we think it is the thing clad in all of this raiment from the previous epoch, and we don't see the division between the two. But by the time you get to the late stage of an epoch, you discover it's capable of shedding things that you didn't think it could shed. And you see that in the medieval, we'll see that in detail in the medieval epoch, as we see how much happened in the late medieval period that people at the early medieval period would have thought was impossible. How can you be medievalism and shed those parts of yourself? Well, it's because those parts, medievalism is a mix of what came before and what's new. And as it's shedding what came before, increasingly it's purifying, making more and more obvious what it is. So I think in the end, the Pope taking sides in local feudal wars, which earlier popes absolutely swore they would not do. Popes declaring that everybody, discovered in North America or South America or Australia aren't people, and you can enslave them and it's fine, and take all their stuff. This was deeply troubling for an enormous number of medievals who thought that was a bridge too far. But instead, it was the purification of what the medieval epoch was actually about, distinct from its promises. So I think in the same way, capital shedding productive value and becoming purely about, if you want it to do anything, you have to have the magic tokens, but you can't because I have them all. So, work for me and I'll give you a little dribble of tokens that you can then pay back to me as you rent the necessities of life, like healthcare and education. This is the purer form of the modernist economy than what we saw 100 years ago or 200 years ago. It was still busy shedding.
Well, the digital reality, I agree with you totally about the abstraction. The digital reality is going to transform even more. they are seriously considering. I mean, first the gold standard supposedly back the dollar or back any currency. Then, in a sense, abandoning the gold standard means that you have a fiat currency that could inflate and deflate, and it's a floating currency. And that's further translated already. That the setup for the digital dollar is the fact that we already primarily do not exchange things in even the fiat currency or dollar bill, right? We use credit cards, and it's really the balance is really in a ledger book, you know, that the central banks and other bankers does. And once you have a digital currency, that means you could just at some point declare you cannot own dollars anymore, any fiat currency. There's not even a trace of materiality left. It's all numbers and a digitization of that. But it's all set up. I mean, right now, if they want to do it, they could do it right now because, well, the poor is going to suffer because they can't have a bank account. Okay. But that could be settled by just like eliminating the banks as well and just settling everything is a big ledger pile in the central Federal Reserve, you know, and they control the flow of digitization of credit cards and this digitization of the thing in itself. And so the middleman in this case, once again, kind of like Amazon, the banks are gone because they're the mediators in a way. And so the banks are gone. It's all centralized in one big, I guess, ledger book that people write into. And that's how you have the balance. They know exactly how much you own, how much you owe, and all that kind of stuff. So that's going to happen. It's simply a matter of time, whether it happens slow enough so people adapt. But like I said, we're 70% adapted already because I used to write checks, which is sort of like not like dollars, but checks. That was a mediation.
These
I
gets
finally
paper.
switched to credit cards because I'm writing checks and all these people in line in back of me is kind of thinking like, come on, like you old fogey, like what the you're wasting our time. And finally I couldn't bear that anymore. So I decided I'll get a credit card and use that as well, rather than have the ire of all these people in the line waiting for me to slowly write my check, But that was already a transition. And once you abandon that, there's no more checkbooks even, Well, I still have a checkbook that I occasionally use, but no more checkbook, no more dollars, only the credit card, And the credit card is going to be gone because there's going to be a centralized digital currency that in a sense is numbers, kind of a super credit card, you'll put it that way. That's it.
Kids are paying with their phones now. They don't even need the credit card.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. Yeah.
That's right. Purely digital. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Just really briefly, because I do think that this is somewhat of an interesting point that actually Stephen actually had brought up, and it relates directly to how this idea of categorizing things. But it's something where there has to be a distinction made between complexity and complicated. And where complexity has a unifying whole, there's a gestalt to it, so to speak. And complicated is you're just adding a bunch of stuff on, and this has direct relationship to what actually Stephen was talking about with shipbuilding in particular, right? Just say you have a bunch of people that are just spending money, and they have to spend the money by the end of the year, and they're building a ship, and they just keep going, and they're just throwing stuff on it, and it becomes this huge complicated mess that becomes unsustainable, where the maintenance costs are actually out of control. But then there's the other end of it, where if it were complex, yes, these were complex machines, And if in complexity is a little different, and there are parts, but there is a overarching architecture that allows them to function much more efficiently. And what we've done in general is we've made things much more complicated in general with everything. And we do that by, in some ways, well, as Phil was saying last week, with the objectification and de-objectification, are objectifying things too much. We're just trying a little too hard when we're putting something together. And so we can do this with schooling. We could do this with machines. We could do this with technology, other forms of technology. We can make it extremely complicated and costly. But I think that, and that's where I think the idea of categorizing, over-categorizing things is problematic. But it is distinct from understanding the parts of a unified whole. And that there is a distinction to be made between those two, because connections and feedback systems operate in a complex system. And that feedback will actually be, in certain cases, self-correcting if you allow it. And so what we do often in modern times is we take things and we make them more complicated, and that's where you start to see the problems that exist. And ultimately, what you'd like to do is get to a point of simplicity where you can deal with more complex problems. But again, that comes back down to maybe having an idea of maybe an idea where you want to go with a particular object. But in general, it's something where it's not necessarily the parts themselves that are the problem. It's the way the parts are constructed. And I would make an argument that in many cases, that when ethics breaks down, that's when you start to see these types of parts become complicated. In other words, and I'm thinking of something like a eugenics movement. We got to categorize everybody into what these, this is that's a lack of ethics, and then you just made the whole world complicated, and you were wrong on top of everything else. So anyway, that's a long way of just making the distinctions, and it is abstract, but it's real.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, it's the interesting, weird thing about the structure of the human mind that we can't process the world very well without our noetic faculties. I mean, it's one of the two major faculties that our brain is constructed around, and yet the use of noesis also introduces enormous problems. And so, there is this way in which the more we rely on our theories and models of things to interact with, say, you, the less we're interacting with the real you that's standing right before us, that we're experiencing. We're sort of our attention span of 7 ± 2 registers that our conscious mind can keep track of is emptying some of those registers of things about you that are real and concrete, and we're replacing them with abstractions. What is your age? What is your median income? What is your profession? And these things aren't you. I mean, you're right here. It's like you might be unhappy. You might have some need right now that we could meet, but I'm sorry, I emptied those registers that were keeping track of that, because it's more important to me to keep track of your income and what your credit score is. And so what's happening gradually is that your actual needs and capabilities are vanishing from the picture of my consciousness and being replaced with this weird caricature. And on the one hand, it means that my decision-making process is becoming a lot less reality-based. It's becoming more based on abstractions and ideologies than it is on the concrete lived experience of Joe Bullock. But But then the weird thing happens where I start acting in the world, not based on the real you, but based on my abstraction of you. And those actions have real world concrete consequences. And so the irreality of my ideology ends up becoming a driver of the concrete reality of your and my lived experience. This is the thing that other animals don't do. And that we only do it because of this weird structure of our brain. So that it ultimately, the relationship between what's real and what's not real becomes just deeply complicated and paradoxical, just rife with paradoxes, contradictions, and and complications. Go ahead, Joe. I can see you had something.
Yeah, just really quickly. I mean, and I think that you were saying like this is what we do in other species. It's complexity is rooted in nature, right? That there. So that's the distinction that we're making here. One is rooted in nature, and one is not rooted in nature.
Yes.
And the further you get away from it, the worse it gets. And so that's, I mean, I think that that's the best way to distinguish between the two, because nature is complex.
Yes.
But there's a elegance to it. And so, I mean, the same things kind of, this manifests itself in different ways in the way we live our lives. But anyway.
That's a good point, Joe. I mean, the relationship between the natural and the artificial here is just, it deeply penetrates this distinction between complexity and complication. So yeah, you get these weird feedback loops in human culture where some of it's being driven by what's concrete and real, but some of it's being driven by what's abstract and irreal. Hegel, in one of his better moments, says to abstract is to be in error. Every time we're relying on ideology and models to tell us what to do instead of relying on the lived experience, there's this major hazard of going wrong, going awry. And what happens as a consequence is, Robert McKee, when he writes in his book Story about the structure of a story, is describing the structure of kind of human interaction with the world and the way in which we have what we think are fairly straightforward needs, and we're in a situation where we're ripe for change because we're dissatisfied with our circumstances. So we take an action that to us seems like the obvious choice of what we should do to fix our problem. But unbeknownst to us, a huge amount of the decision making that went into that wasn't reality based. It was based on our noesis. And based on that noesis, we took the wrong action. And so what actually happens is different from what we expected and needed to happen, or wanted it to happen anyway. And that gap between what we wanted to happen and what actually really happened is charged with emotion. And he says that series of, now I have a different set of reactions, and so I take another step to try to solve the problem. And it too is charged with noesis. And it too opens up a new gap between the new goal I had and what I tried to do to solve it. And that's the spine of the story. Underneath the plot, the spine is that series of emotional charges that we get because things didn't turn out the way that we thought they would when we took an action. And so this creates this weird feedback loop where our behavior is only partly driven by what's actually happening, and it's hugely driven by our worldview, our interpretive framework. And that's why you Google, you could pretty easily come across discussions of storytellers talking about the difference between wants and needs as being central to storytelling. And the want level, although it sounds like it's more animal id level and therefore maybe more concrete, is actually a lot more ideological. It's based on what I think the world is like and what I think I want rather than my actual natural circumstances. So the result is, other animals, it's not that they don't have noesis, but that their noesis serves their gnosis. And so they're heavily driven by reality. This cat on my lap at a certain time of day is going to get up and start harassing me because she's hungry. And it's not that she imagines she's hungry or she planned in advance that this is the time of day I'm supposed to eat or any of those things. She's hungry. It's very reality driven. Whereas I'm likely to eat a meal or not eat a meal based entirely not on what my concrete need for food is, but based on what I thought it should be or shouldn't be, or because I got lost in work and forgot to eat. This irreality is driving things. So we'll eventually get to the text. The main, I just want to just throw a tether in there right now to show the relationship, which is when we get to it, he's going to be talking about the different types of character that there are, and how a society could be derived from that, from the ancient worldview. But part of what those distinctions are about, as we've talked about in previous weeks, is they're about what is our relationship to gnosis and noesis. Are we slaves to our gnosis? Are we slaves to our noesis? Or do we learn how to pit them against each other and harness them into a dynamic system to try not to be slaves to either one? And that this is where the three character types in the ancient worldview derive from. And these things that, although it feels on the surface like we're far afield from the text, in fact, we're right there. I mean, the questions that Joe was just talking about just strike directly to these questions of character type from which the Greeks tried to rationalize a class system. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, Phil just stimulated me no end, especially since I'm going to get to bring back that 21st century misunderestimated Texas philosopher W. As he said and observed, Phil, the French don't even have a word for entrepreneurship. But we often, I think, mistranslate entrepreneurship because, I mean, literally, it's taking between, which is exactly what Amazon does. It takes goods between the producers of those goods and the customers of those goods and extracts its fee. They are true entrepreneurs. Maybe not French entrepreneurs, but anyway. And the other thing is you'll find on YouTube great series of lectures on modern monetary theory, Phil, that money doesn't have value. The way you get money is you have governments and they levy taxes, and they only accept their currency as payment for those taxes. So people have to scurry around doing whatever they can, selling things to the government and selling things among each other or whatever in order to get sufficient amount of the government's money to give back to the government to pay their taxes. And that's what creates the ultimate demand for money, is the ability, is that it can be used to pay taxes. But as one of these YouTube things said, guy was brilliant. There is government debt and there is government currency. Government currency is printed with green ink on paper, and government debt is printed in yellow ink on paper. And both have both are backed by the full faith and credit of the government. So it largely depends on whether you like green ink or yellow ink. And then, I mean, this is, I was, the kind that read Heilbrunner's, the worldly philosophers, where all the economists from Ricardo on, money had some value. And modern monetary theory says, no, it's bits in a computer. It is nothing but a way of settling accounts. I didn't believe that at first, but then I listened to a few and now I'm persuaded. I mean, it's all got their name on it, so it must be theirs. It's not mine. You're great, Phil. You're just great.
Thanks, Donald. I think we have a couple new folks with hands up. So Phil, before I call on you, would you mind if I called on Stefan and Dave so that they can have a chance to to dive
Yeah,
into?
that's fine. That's fine.
Okay, but don't forget what you were going to say. Stick a pin in it. So, Stefan, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Welcome to the call.
Hey, thanks for having me. Seen your meetings or posts and meetup a few times and finally made one. I was tuned into a few things there. Someone, I don't know your names very well yet, talking about objectification. And from my perspective, the first point I wanted to make was about objectification or over objectification is, flows into what you were describing about gnosis. Is that nous or I'm not sure which versions of the words you were pronouncing or how I understand mispronounced. Okay, thank you. And as I look at it, it's the objectification versus recognition, and this plays from a social dynamic to a practical dynamic. Where we recognate something, our perspective and concept of it is is recognizing it instead of objectifying it, and over complexification or over complicating something versus complexity fits in with that. But whenever you were going into your point about how we follow that, need versus want, one of the things I would that came to mind with me from the social perspective is the rampant dissociation that societies are struggling with now. People are disconnecting from their needs and wants in a way that we have never seen before in human history. There's been a lot less complexity and a lot less complication in the way we lived until the modern era and the information age, where we're just inundated with so much stimulus and so many demands on our attention that we just start to disconnect. And then people aren't even necessarily acting on their needs or wants; they're acting based on the influence of the stimuli. And again, you were talking about how we operate based our wants are based on what we believe. And I agree with that very much. I have my own personal saying is we are what we do what we believe. And what we believe make our actions, and that makes our identity, at least how most people recognize themselves. Like, I'm a baker, I'm a mechanic, whatever. That's tied in very closely to most people's identities. But then the problem is you get split this off, you start disconnecting people from their actions and thoughts and their feelings, and you get a different level of complication, not complexity. And that just, it's like looking for the needle in the haystack, but now you set the haystack on fire. So those are the thoughts I wanted to share. Thank you for having me, Thor. I'll pass to the next person.
Thanks, Stefan. Thanks for sharing that. Interesting stuff. So, Dave, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. It's been very interesting joining. I typically have a conflict on Monday noons, but a friend came up with a positive COVID test, so we got it canceled. So I've seen this notice a couple times. I had not heard of this philosopher, and it's been interesting to dial into it. I want to react a little bit to what my friend Joe was talking about, complexity and complication. Because it seemed like we always drive to make things as simple as possible. And so many times that means, I think, creating others. I'm kind of a complex person. I'm left-handed. And it's interesting, the judgment of the French, either you're gauche or you're adroit. And I think there's a lot of value judgment in that. And I've understand other languages have very similar judgment. So us left-handed people, who I read one time, is obviously means I was brain damaged. And of course, my other handicap is I'm red-green colorblind, as of 10% of all males are. And also I'm twice married and twice divorced, which is interesting. But yeah, we judge people by our first impressions. Gee, do they have the same skin tone that I do? Their facial features, how they're dressed, and if we are in conversation, can they speak with good English? We make a lot of these judgments very, very quickly. And it's unfortunate. I remember back, I think it was about 2008, we had a big financial crisis. And there were of interest 12 million unemployed American workers and 12 million undocumented workers from Mexico living in our country. And they weren't the ones that had the jobs. That all the jobs got shipped overseas to the Philippines, China, and Vietnam. But that connection was made. And so immigrants were the source of all evil. We had to build a wall. And of course, it's interesting, back in our history, we've demonized immigrants before, the Irish, the Southern Europeans, or whatever. But I note we have a couple of Black ladies that may join us. I think it was Gabriel and Sharon or whatever. I'm going to put in the chat a gentleman's name who had his 50 years of fame about 50 years ago, 15 minutes of fame. Joe B. Anderson went to my dad's junior high on the wrong side of the tracks in Topeka, Kansas. And I know my dad talked to him. I was a great football player. He was the ironic, big African-American guy that, intimidating and all this other stuff. But when he got to high school, he applied himself and graduated in the top 10%. My class was 500. He was in the class 4 years ahead of me when my sister was in 1951. So he was a war baby. So I suspect their class was probably 400. So he was in the top 40 out of 400. I was in college prep and I didn't recognize I don't remember any Black students at all in our college prep of my class. But when I started high school, the second assembly, our principal was there and he said, well, I apologize, I wasn't there for the first assembly. I was back at West Point and Joe Anderson was being recommended or recognized as the commandant of the cadets. And I don't know whether that means a vote of the cadets or a vote of the faculty. Either way, I think is equally prestigious. He went on, well, and so it's interesting, the French, I mentioned the French, have interest about our African Americans because they're a very monochromatic society, in other words, lily white. And so some French filmmakers saw this, and there were only 4 Black men in that class at West Point, and I'm sure it was several hundred. So he followed and made a documentary film that was shown in the United States called The Anderson Platoon. And Joe got several combat awards or whatever, but of interest, he succeeded financially. He went on several corporate boards and profits and nonprofits. So you might be interested in looking up a very successful African-American man. We all know General Colin Powell, that this is another one. But the thing is, we make all these snap judgments that all Negroes, of course, are inferior because all whites are better than all Blacks. But it's not true. We shouldn't be making snap judgments. It's very easy to do and very tempting. And a lot of leaders, unfortunately, push us into judging about immigrants, et cetera, because we're all immigrants. But anyway, I am joining the group, and thank you very much for letting me be a part of it today.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, it's an interesting thing, the way that we have such an appetite for snap judgments. We like simple answers. And part of what modernity does is insist that we're better at everything than the previous epochs were. So if we make snap judgments, if there's any unfortunate aspects to that at all, then it must be that people in the past also made snap judgments, and maybe even faster than we do. But they certainly could never have been more thoughtful than we are. Because to be thoughtful, we think is a good thing. So we don't want anybody in the past to have more of that than we do. We're the thoughtful ones. And this is built into the ideology of modernity. It's right in the name, right? The name is self-praise. We're praising ourselves for not being obsolete, for being modern. So it's hard for us to conceive of the idea that that we might be atypical, that this snap judgment thing might not be the normal way people behave. This might be the way that moderns specifically behave, and that we've been cultivated to make snap judgments and to desire quick, stereotypical snap judgments. And from the modernist perspective, that idea is a heresy. It's not acceptable. It must not be the case that we're worse than the past in any way. But of course, the reality of any epoch is that its worldview is going to be better in some ways and worse in others. And the modernist worldview is a worldview like any other, and it's going to be inferior in some ways. Heaven forbid, in some ways, it's going to be inferior to others. And this snap judgment thing you're putting your finger on, I think Kenneth Smith would argue, is pretty central to the modern world, and it goes hand in hand with the ease with which we replace real people with abstractions of people, where we're taught to do that.
Yeah, and see, the heck of it is, you meet somebody on the street, it's impossible to say, okay, give me your whole biography and your whole elevator speech for 2 hours, so I will understand who you are,
Right.
and can relate to you.
Right.
It's impossible. We have to go to simplicity.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, we think it's entirely doable to replace somebody with a tiny little, headline summary. And in fact, if somebody can't give us the headline summary, then we think that's that's their problem. They're inadequate communicator. They should learn how to describe themselves appropriately. And by appropriately, we mean don't take up much of our time. Where
And forbid they don't speak English.
Right. Oh my God. So I'm gonna bump Phil one more time because Joe has to go. So this is his only chance to make a comment here. So I'm gonna give it to him. Go ahead, Joe, and then we'll do Phil.
Yeah, it's more of a question actually, more than anything. And just thinking this through, there's this distinction between having a simple answer to a complex problem, right? Which actually could be very bad, right? Just as Dave demonstrated, right? And I see you're different, therefore my simple answer is that it's not necessarily right. There's something wrong with that. But there is the simplicity of something where you're getting to the essence and understanding that's another human being, that we're similarities. We live in complexity. We both the complexity that we experience is very different, but then how does that then come together in our, to have a greater level of understanding? So like there's there's simple answers, but then there's simplicity where you have the essence of what it is that you're trying to do. And then you can kind of build on top of that. Whereas it's more of an organic process versus one that is you're actually imposing something on something else. And that would be, I don't know, because I've been trying to think about simplicity because I think it does in engineering terms, actually, I think it has a lot of value because I think we over-engineer things. So that in this particular instance, but anyway, I don't know if that's a proper way of thinking about it, but anyway, as you mentioned, I do have to go, and thank you, Phil, for your patience.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, see, just to simplify, to be able to see past the skin into the human being, I think I'd just put it that way.
Yeah. You see what Joe's talking about here. You see it in Aristotle, and Aristotle says it in an ancient way, but we read it in a modern way when he talks about the essence of a species. What is its arete? What is the thing that species is best at? And when Aristotle says that, and we read it from a modern perspective, and so we want to read noesis into it. We want to read him as equating. For example, if it's a cheetah and cheetahs are fast, we want it to be that anything fast is a cheetah, because cheetah and fast have now been equated. We're looking for a simple answer, a noetic answer that rules out all the true complexity of the situation. But he's not a modern. He's speaking like an ancient. He doesn't mean that speed is all there is to a cheetah. He means that it's because it's their core arete, all kinds of other complications ensue as a result of that simple essence, right? Why does the spine flex the way that it does when they're running? Why is the tail so long and used like a rudder when they're turning and cornering? Why are they raised the way that they're raised by their mothers? All of these things, this whole rich complexity flows out of this essence. And that's the difference between an essence and an abstraction. The ancients meant the essence to be like a principle that is a fountain of order generating all kinds of complex consequences down the road. But we, in our hypernoetic mode, not inclined to think with Vernunft, as Hegel would put it, where we're using both gnosis and noesis, but inclined to think only with Verstand, where we only allow evidence in to the extent that it supports or rationalizes our ideology. We want to reduce things down to equations. So therefore, the cheetah doesn't have the essence of fast, the cheetah equals fast, and thus we get these caricatured consequences. This is what keeps happening with all of these big modernist plans that we make, strategies for society and the world and how we're going to live, and they end up being based on these abstract caricatures rather than on reality. And this is where I want to go full circle with what Joe said earlier and say the problem with these oversimplifications is because they don't match reality. When we try to act on them, they miss the mark, hamartia, the Greek term. And as a result, all kinds of problems are caused by our attempt to solve the original problem that weren't there before we acted. We've now created those problems. And we don't really want to acknowledge them, but some of them are so serious that we can't avoid them. So what we do next is we stick with our strategy. We don't say, oh, wow, caricaturing is a terrible way to deal with the world. Maybe we should have a rich, complex relationship with reality. We say, no, I must have picked the wrong caricature. So let me patch my caricature with another caricature that I'll add on top of that. And surely that will now solve the problem. Because now instead of dealing with the infinite number of details that I should have dealt with, I'm now trying to reduce it down to 2 things. And so now I set in motion my new strategy, my new policy. And of course, it doesn't work either. And this is how a legal system grows from something short and readable that everybody can learn into a giant labyrinth that even full-time experts can't master even just a part of it, because it's so big. You know, we're building this complicated labyrinth, or as Kenneth likes to quote Kafka, we're digging the pit of Babel. You know, and it's instead of going up closer to God, we're going down and down into a trap of our own making. All these complications, which are the direct result of oversimplification, which is our native idiom as moderns, you know, hyperverstand, hypernoetic. So thank you for bringing that up, Joe. I mean, it really ties up this whole area of discussion.
No, thank you. And I think you just explained it more beautifully than any of the engineers that I know that have made the mistake that as far as thinking things more, we just add things on to problems, and all of a sudden you're adding on, and it's like, oh my God, what's this monstrosity that I have? And it's like it's dysfunctional.
Yeah.
It has no function.
Yeah.
It's further away from nature. There's no function. But thank you. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I see it in software. You know, where the software came out with the wrong answer. You know, they ran 1 test, maybe they ran 10 tests, and each time the number was 1 too big. So they find some spot in the code and they subtract 1, and they say, there, now it works. But of course, they didn't run all the tests they should have run. They only ran some of them, and they guessed wrong about what the problem was. So now, occasionally the answer is right, but the rest of the time it's off 1 in the other direction because they didn't fix the real problem. They were just trying to patch over. You come up with some quick, hurried way to get to the answer, and instead what they got to is something even more messed up than before they touched it. I talk about this a lot when I'm teaching debugging, and how you have to not be satisfied with looking at the symptoms. You have to go down into the code and find out what the ultimate root cause of that set of symptoms is. Because until you do that, you're not going to know what the right fix is. Your fixes are almost certainly going to make things worse, and they usually do. Phil, you've been so patient. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, that question, I have to pause for that question. Is whether the Tower of Babel has a pit. Does the pit go all the way down? Or does it have moments of feedback loop that in a sense stops the pit from going all the way down? Because we're in big trouble if it goes all the way down. You know, it's like, and but I want to get back to what Donald said and tie it to what Joe said in a way, because it seems very interesting. What Donald said to me, given the optimistic interpretation, is that he's saying that something like digitization of money and digitization of property, as in the cloud, it's actually the leveraging of how to say the transport system, the distribution. And I admit that distribution is part of the whole structure of capital. There's no doubt about it. And I think Evergreen being stuck at the the Suez Canal taught us that lesson, and COVID taught us that lesson, ad infinitum. And everybody is reshoring now in order to, in a sense, shorten the supply chain, to shorten the distribution, simplify the distribution for resiliency. So given that interpretation, it does seem like that you're talking about Shiva. This is constructive destruction, right? Creative destruction, and which allows us to build a new structure that, in a sense, is more efficient and more virtuous in a way. But I must remind you, in one sense, the problem is any system, anything exists in a complex of what I call ecological structure that expands and contracts in various different ways. And there's a fluid grid that is transformed. And we only are beginning to understand ecology and how, you catch all the big fish, the whole structure changes because the gestalt of that system is not only the figure, but the ground that it works in. And the problem with that is that this efficiency of distribution might be its various way, and its creative destruction cause a lot of collateral damage. Then you have to ask the question, does that collateral damage mean anything? Is it actually something that's important that we should not just say, oh, that's the way it goes, you gotta, how should, what was the quote now? You have to, I guess, well, I forgot what the quote was. But in some sense, if that's the case, will you just say, well, that's tough. That's the way it is. People suffer. A lot of people lose their job, but we do have a more efficient system. But the problem is that there has to be a transition. If you are focused on a kind of humanism in which people do matter, you have to figure out a kind of transition. You are not just saying, well, they're the ones that's left over at the slaughter bench after the creative destruction, So therefore, there's much more to consider rather than just the pure efficiency, even if what you're saying is right. I'm not sure it's right, but I'll give the credit that maybe it's right. That there's a lot of collateral damage that happens, and I wonder whether that fits the bill, because we do care about, at least we profess to care about other human beings, okay? And maybe we should care more about nature itself and all that kind of stuff. Now, transitioning to what Joe said, I appreciate what he's saying about complexity and complicated. The problem is, even if you limit itself to spaceship Earth and not the cosmos and all the structures that's within it, is humanity able to understand the complexity of it in order to maneuver it? And I recently heard a thing that really enlightened me a bit, that and this really gets to the conscious and the unconscious, If rationality and all that is pretty much in the conscious level, then in a sense, I think Freud, but certainly there was people that preceded him, like Shakespeare and so forth. The subconscious level is a very important part that drives our behavior in a way. But the subconscious also include bodily functions. I'm not thinking about my heart. Sometimes I do, but mostly I don't. I'm certainly not thinking about my liver or my spleen. I don't even know what the spleen is, all sorts of things, like they take care of themselves. And how are they so smart enough that they seem smarter than me? Because I don't understand them, yet I function with them. The strange thing is, not only are they taking care of business on their own, okay, the spleen or whatever, the appendix or whatever, things I had never even heard of, it's like they seem to have a conscious connection to a degree to other things that's operating. So there is a, it doesn't go all the way down. In other words, they sort of mediate between themselves. Not only that, for instance, when I move consciously in a way, things automatically happen, but I am not consciously conducting to the degree of exactness. Sometimes when I hurt a leg, then I have to carefully put my foot down to make sure it hits the ground. But most of the time, I just do it. Okay. And it's like, how does that happen? That in a sense, how do I maneuver all this complexity, not only the unconscious, but trying to understand the world, the complexity of the figure-ground relationship. And, as Heraclitus would like to say, nature loves to hide. I mean, it doesn't give away its secrets. It's just very difficult. So to reduce it to a very thin mind, so to speak, very thin conscious mind, and to, in a sense, to be able to conduct all of this stuff that's happening is beyond human capacity in a way. So in some sense, we have to admit that we do not have the capacity to be the conductor to this orchestra of just our nearsighted ecostructure that we're dealing with. So I think we have to be very careful what we do, because we have to now choose, like, is it more important that we consider how many Palestinians got bombed in relationship to the survival of Israel? I mean, like, all these things is so complex. It's like, and we have now shipped out that complexity. I'm not saying that nobody understands the spleen. I certainly do not. I do not even know how to, fix my car. I have to have a mechanic. So we are so dependent on these things that the society almost depends on bits and pieces of expert information that we have to track down, in order to say, you need to fix my knee. You need to fix my carburetor. Because I don't know how to do it. If you're left for me to do it, things has gotten so complex that it is complicated to an ordinary person. And I don't know if I have even the directory to dial up. By the way, I don't have a phone, but let's say I did, to dial up the expert, to find the expert, because I can't find it. I'm trying to find a good dentist. I can't find the expert, dial them up, help them diagnose what I do, explain what I do so I understand it. Yeah, I kind of agree with you. Go ahead and do it. Or I say, no, you're just a quack. I'm not going to do it. I mean, like, it's so complex. We're so dependent on that system existing altogether. Like, we are, well, no wonder we're living in a state of a neurosis. Like I said, I am just trying to keep myself from falling into psychosis because that's what is going to get very serious, right? But neurosis is where we're at in a very, very complex society that none of us understand. None of us understand. In Aristotle's time, he comes close to understanding just about everything because there was a lot less that he has to deal with. But nowadays, it's just so complicated. That's what I have to say. It's like, so you got bits of information. I'm trying to learn a little bit about the market and the economy, and it's just so complicated. Every day I go, I feel like I just don't know, and I'm just being played by car sharks. Because they know how to lure you in and then dump. Dump. It's like, yeah, it's like, well, at least I'm smart enough to avoid Las Vegas. If I go to Las Vegas, I'm determined I could afford to lose $100, but that's it. And I could call that, maybe if I could call that, well, that's just the price of fun. Okay. But if you get trapped into, like, being lured into the wealth. You could just pull that slot machine and just silver dollars will just pour out like you are being lured in by the experts. Because they are experts in what they do. And the problem is in the world now, we're not playing chess, we're playing poker. And that's the problem that we all have. That's it, Bill. Thank you,
Phil.
Donald. Thank you for your criticism.
Appreciate it. Thanks. I'm going to call on Stephen, and then I'm going to take us to the text. Go ahead, Stephen. Tell us what's on your mind.
Is a persistent problem. I suppose it relates a lot to what Phil was saying, but a persistent problem with our rationalists. And it gets really bad with some people. They figure the whole universe is just one big piece of mathematics, and there must be a perfect answer to the equation. That's what we're always looking for. Everything's everything's an equation now. I only have to find the answer. This is a type of monism. It's a belief that the entire universe is simply one substance or one measure. And ultimately, you can reduce everything to that one measure. The term monism has become a bit lost. It was something which they might have expressed in the 19th century. But your latter-day rationalists will so intensely believe in the idea that things can be reduced to a single answer. I can't figure it out, because how do these people know that there is only one reducible principle in the cosmos? We don't know that. There might be several principles, and if there is, you could wind up with contradictions that can't be resolved. I don't seem to think about this. There's this tendency for these rationalists, who are only human, to think that their vision of the cosmos is godlike. This is bizarre. We're only so far removed from a cat or a dog, us humans. Yeah, we've got a few better things going for us, but would we expect a dog, which is only so far removed from us, to understand the full nature of the cosmos? I go, why not? There's only that much difference between us and the dog, or us and a cat. In many respects, we're very similar, and yet the latter-day rationalists think the ape that stands upright somehow has got the measure of all things. I just find this bizarre. But remember that word monism. It's the idea that everything can be measured by a single principle, which it's rationalistic. Rationalism is the belief that I can take a standard and measure everything else by that standard. Now, we do adopt rationales. There's a big problem with this. We fail to realize we adopt rationales. For example, if you adopt the rationale that Jews are evil, then the Holocaust is a logical consequence. People never question their base rationales. They think that they're the substance of the cosmos, but no, those base rationales are most often themselves a series of beliefs or observations. And yet today, the rationalists are still going full steam on this monist proposition. And it's just something I keep on, it just never quits. People keep on, they can't think outside that box. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, there's a respect with which the more noetic, more we rely on noesis, the more Verstand we engage in, the less we're actually thinking. We're letting the ideology think for us. It's a variation on the thought terminating cliche to have an ideology. Thought terminating cliche is we have arrived at the answer we were looking for, and so we're done. We know it's time to stop because we're there. This is the goal. God is great might be a thought terminating cliche. Um, there's thousands of them. I mean, we thrive on them. But the kissing cousin to the thought terminating cliche is the ideological train of thought, which is if I can find some station to board the train, I'm done thinking. Now the ideology will think for me and get me to one of its thought terminating cliches. Where are the right places to end this discussion? Well, the ideology will tell me what we're driving towards, what we're aiming to conclude. And so you see that. I mean, what Stephen's talking about, the kind of monism that's involved, it has a structure and it can be analyzed. And ultimately, the critique that Kenneth Smith has is that it's a form of escapism. It's an attempt to evade the discomfort of a finite being confronted with an infinite world and having to conclude that we're inadequate to the task to which we're called. We could accept the difficulty and humbly pursue knowledge in an imperfect way, in an attempt to get at least as good a knowledge as we can get, or we can escape into an ideology which assures us that it will provide us with the answers being the thought terminating cliches. And by provide us, it means it's going to spread into us these vast networks of trains of association until eventually you can hardly bring up any topic without it being next door to one of the stations to get onto the ideological train. And then the train thinks for us and takes us to one of the conclusions. We reach the end and celebrate and say, see how smart I am. I got to one of the approved conclusions. But in fact, I wasn't thinking the whole time. I was engaging in strict noesis, which doesn't qualify as rationality according to Hegel, or according to the Greeks, or according to Kenneth Smith. It's one of the two tools in the toolkit that we have to have. But if it's the only one you've got, you become the man with the hammer, and pretty soon you're Procrustes torturing the truth on the bed of your mind, and nothing comes out of it, alive. So let's turn to the text. I'm gonna for the folks who joined after the beginning, I'm putting the link back in to the text, and then I'm gonna repaste the two parts of paragraph 4. We've got a size limitation in the chat, so I've got to do it in two bytes, not in 1 byte. So where we are in section G of chapter 4, where we are is we're looking at this idea that the Greeks may have originally invented their class system not for the reasons that Aristotle gives. They originally invented their class system because they started out as a conquering people who moved in from the space between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and they moved into a Europe where there wasn't anybody like them, and they conquered. Everywhere they went, they conquered, and the conquered peoples were made into their slave caste. And the purpose of that slave caste was to do all the work so the conquerors would have their time freed up to focus on, being really good at warfare so that they could go on to conquer the next group. It was a variation on what we later see in Imperial Rome, this idea of an expansionist model, that this all works as long as I keep spreading. But if I have to hold still, I get problems. And of course, one of the problems we see is the Bronze Age collapse, where, now that we've filled up all the space and everybody everywhere around us, all we see is more people like ourselves. Where are we supposed to spread and conquer? How are we going to feel like heroes? Well, how about we become sacker of cities? So you spent all this time building these beautiful cities that have all of, from the, running water and literature and so on. And, I don't feel like I'm a decent human being unless I burn you to the ground and prove that I'm better than you are. And next thing we know, all the cities are in flames. Everybody's reduced to poverty. There's a population crash. There's illiteracy. And the Greeks rose up out of that crisis after the Dark Age. The Greek culture that we think of as classical Greek, even what we think of as archaic Greek culture, archaic and then classical Greek culture, they both are responses to the disasters that their forebears caused for themselves through the relentless pursuit of this this conquest-oriented lifestyle. So in addition to inheriting the lands and the language and a number of other things, they inherited this class system. And they set about trying to rationalize it. Why do I deserve to own slaves? Why should that person be a slave and I should be free? Well, I can't just say it's because you couldn't stop me. That's why. This is not a satisfying answer. That's exactly the answer that leads to, why should I stop with you? Why shouldn't I try to conquer my free neighbor? And next thing you know, we're back to a Bronze Age collapse. The only way out of it was when this new approach arose, which is that there needs to be a better reason than because I can, so that I don't go around destroying everything just to see whether or not I can. And the rationale became, there must be a reason why some people are free and some people are slaves. So they took the old rationalizations of their Mycenaean forebears and they tried to tune them up into a philosophy. And the more they did that, the more interesting answers that they got. And the more they developed this model of human character, which they didn't start out doing out of a desire for science. They started out doing out of a desire to rationalize. But the only way that it would be satisfying was if it had a strong reality basis. So they started adding more and more reality to their model of human character. And next thing you know, you end up with a model of human character that's frankly more sophisticated than the modern one, because it acknowledges diversity in human beings in a way that ours doesn't. And when I say diversity, I don't mean the everybody's different nonsense that modernity says. I mean actual meaningful characterological species level diversity, where there aren't an infinite number of characters. There's a limited number of them, and they're driven by nature and natural laws and the principles of nature, and they're related to each other in very specific ways. This is a far cry from modernity's either we're all equal or we're all different, both of which are sort of totalitarianizing, thought-terminating cliches. Their model requires you to look at people and think and engage with them. Like Donald said, what is Socrates doing in these dialogues? He's interrogating people to try to reveal their character. The ancient perspective is, because there is a structure to human character and its relationship to our thinking and behavior, it follows that structure can be interrogated, just like the structure of nature can be interrogated. Science applies. When we get beyond we're all the same and we're all different, when we get to the idea that there is structure going on in the human mind and human character and human culture, then interrogation becomes possible. And that's what Socrates is trying to do. So this section is really exploring, section F is exploring the ancient relationship between character and class. So if it starts in injustice and conquest and might makes right, and passes through this hideous crisis, what it's developing into is, on the one hand, an interesting model of human nature and human character, but on the other, a new kind of crisis, which Aristotle is documenting. And the crisis is, okay, now that the rationalization for our existing class system looks so good, it starts and works so well and is so scientific, it starts to be usable as a way to evaluate whether or not we're in compliance with it, right? Are we in fact organizing our class system according to these different character types, or have we screwed it up badly? Are there people who we have made slaves of who ought to be free? And are there people in government who have the character types of slaves? Have we screwed this up? And Aristotle's critique is, yeah, we botched it big time. And he's not the first to have this critique. I mean, Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War, it's why he documents all these speeches between the invading armies and the defenders on the wall. He wants you to hear the nature of the disagreements that they're having, so that you can see who's dealing in good faith and who's just lying, saying whatever they need to say in order to rationalize the conquest that they want to make, which to the Greeks is a terrible sin. I mean, and we've mentioned this before, but for the people who are new to this group, the critical thing for the Greeks is they don't ever want to make the mistake that their forebears made. Of all the mistakes there are to make in the world, that is the most unacceptable, because it destroyed everything. They had to claw their way out of a dark age because of the blunders of their heroic ancestors. And how do we know that they care about this? Because they made every single Greek hear the Iliad Iliad and the Odyssey and the rest of the epic cycle. They said the core education of Greeks is that they will all be exposed to the terrible story of what went wrong. How our heroic people blundered on a heroic scale and ruined everything. And the reason that they want every single Greek without exception to be marinated in that from the moment that they can start to understand language is because they want every single Greek to have it in their heart. I am not going to be that guy. I'm not going to be Agamemnon pissing off Achilles on the plains of Tor and almost ruining everything. I'm not going to be Achilles throwing a tantrum and having the Greeks almost lose everything. I'm not going to be Odysseus coming up with the clever solution to how do we protect the marriage between Helen and Menelaus without causing a civil war, but in so doing, destroying Bronze Age civilization by accident. I don't want to be Oedipus accidentally murdering my dad and marrying my mom, right? These tragic figures exist so that they stick in the minds of every single Greek, so that there is not just a worldview, but an ethos married to it that is a deep, potent motivator to keep us from doing what our ancestors did before. It was their core thing. And that's why when Aristotle's writing his quote dry works, moderns read them and go, well, this I don't understand. This is so dry. They're actually deeply sarcastic works because he's describing how things should be. And his audience, which is not us, but is his contemporary Greeks, they all know perfectly well that the world he's describing doesn't exist. When he says this is what a democracy should be like, this is what an aristocracy should be like, this is what enlightened despotism would look like. And by the way, here's the bad versions for comparison. Any Greek looking around would see that their own governments were not the good versions; they were the bad versions that he's describing. He's writing for a specific audience, knowing that they care about these things the way he does. So he's critiquing the class system, and he's doing it on this basis that the model that they developed to rationalize their slave system ended up being superior to the slave system itself and ultimately calling it into question. So that's what we're reading here. This is what's being set up. The paragraphs that have come before this, paragraphs 1 through 3, have really established this idea that, first of all, medievals and moderns like to pretend that we're all the same, but the ancients didn't do that. The ancients believed fervently that nature has structure and meaning to it, right? The very first section, A, nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth. That was where we began chapter 4. So it's not just the nature around us that has structure and meaning and flow. It's the nature inside of us, our own characters, that has meaning and structure and flow. So there is a diversity of people, and that's a good thing, and the Greeks utterly believe in it. And then this idea that character is not like the monotheistic God, a single source of unified design and plan, but rather it's more like the polytheistic pantheon of the ancients. It's a bunch of different powers within us whose activities are not coordinated and move off in different directions, causing our behavior and our impulses, so that we're conflicted within ourselves. We can disagree even with ourselves. There is a multitude within us. And that this is the model, this heterogeneity, both describes the way that one person is different from another, and also describes the way that I'm different from myself from one moment to the next, as one part of me versus another gains ascendance or has more influence over this part of my life. So he's established that part in paragraphs 1 and 2. And in paragraph 3, he's really dealing with this issue of agency versus contingency. The way in which our outcomes are not free and our outcomes are not fated. Neither of the answers that moderns give to free will versus determinism is the truth. But instead, at every moment, there's a tug of war between agency and contingency. How much is what we will to be so, i.e., quote, free, and how much is fated to be so? And he shows the way that there are paradoxes involved in this. If the things that we want, the things that we think we are free, if we can take the actions to get those things, if those things are determined by our character, and we didn't get to choose our character, then when we think we are most free, we're behaving in a way that is the most fated. It's this where our behavior and choices are symptoms of our character in that case. And likewise, if if our desires were going to lead us into disaster, but the contingencies of the world around us blocked us from having what we wanted, in that moment, our life might end up better than it would have if we got what we wanted. Which is ironic, because getting what we wanted would have led to something we didn't want. Whereas getting what we didn't want leads to something we did want, which was to avoid this catastrophe that was going to happen if we got what we wanted. But we can't see all that because we're just finite beings trying to figure it out. And the really interesting part, which is where ethos anthropoi daimon from Heraclitus comes into play, is that the Greek take is that you can learn to interrogate yourself in the same way that Socrates interrogates his conversational partners. And through that interrogation, discover what your character is, just like Socrates can discover what somebody else's character is. And once you know what your character is, you have the option, you have a new option you never had before, which is you could work on saying, maybe I don't want to be like that. Maybe I can work on cultivating my character into a different direction. And this is core to this belief system. It's at the core. The word for nature in Greek is phusis. Phusis means becoming, changing, right? So our character is our nature, which means it is never static. It is always in the case, is always in the process of unfolding from something else into what it has become, and also from what it is into something new in the future. And that means we have the option, if we can learn what that character is, to intervene and guide its development to take a different path than it would have taken. The Greeks believe that's the real freedom, not getting what you want, but learning to cultivate your desires in a healthier, better direction by changing your character. So this is the setup for paragraph 4. All of that's the backstory behind this. The last thing I'll add for Stefan and Dave is part of the reason we take so long working our way through this text is that Kenneth Smith, his use of language is very atypical. If you see a word in here that's a potent word and you think you know what it means, it almost certainly means something different from that. He's like carefully gone back through the history of existentialist philosophy and defined a bunch of terms in very precise ways so that he, even if nobody in the world understands him, he at least can say what he means, which he can't do if he's using the popular definitions of words for reasons that we've talked about in previous sessions. So let's start into this opening sentence. It says, as creatures of the natural order, humans cannot escape the palette of subjective resources they have been endowed with. Let's break this up. Creatures of the natural order. So first of all, he's using the medieval term creatures. We have been created, right? We are not the God of Genesis. We did not make ourselves. Something else made us. And so this therefore puts us in the realm of the ancient in media res. We find ourselves in the middle of a story that we didn't begin. We don't know how we got here. And half of the battle is figuring out how we got here. Because if we don't figure out how we got here, we're going to be in the same boat as Oedipus, taking reasonable actions that turn out to lead to terrible consequences. I'm going to pause there because I see Phil's got his hand up. Come off mute, Phil, and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, that's why your explanation draws in an interesting question for me is like, and I'm going to try to set it in the context of Plato and Aristotle, as much as I know about them, which is not very much. I mean, Plato does seem to underscore a kind of contrast between philosophy and poetry, or more specifically, the theater and, let's say, philosophical thinking. And in a way, I have my doubts in a way because he does use a kind of theater, not a actual theater of presentation of something on a stage as a representation of what might be, which is sort of in that sense, versus a theater that's sort of a play that's sort of only read and not enacted. Let's say, okay, enacted. because it does remind me, the dialogue does remind me a little bit dry maybe of people in the theater, but all they do is talk. That kind of thing. All right, so and there seems to be a difference, however, beyond that is like, and that's a question I want to ask, is like, it seems like people like Sophocles or Aeschylus, and Euripides were interested in actually showing the tragic stuff, the bad stuff that happens, right? So you actually literally see like, oh my God, it's happening, right? And whereas Plato seemed to be more careful about talking about it and there's almost a verge of censorship in a way, right? Kind of downplaying the bad stuff. And not that it's not shown to any degree, but sort of saying, you see that's wrong. I mean, so sort of like a kind of censorship that emphasized, let's just show the good stuff, how you could become good. That seems like a real difference, and how you do it in terms of educational system, if we could think of it that way. It just teaches the virtues, pretty much. You might have to mention the bad stuff, but it's on the side. It's sort of tamped down. Versus going and say, "Oh God, this is bad. Like, we can't do that," which is like it's in your face, so to speak. Could you say about that transition? Because later than Plato, then that part is even dried up and it just become a straight treatise about what morality and virtues might be, rather than even a kind of like I said, a written play that is not ever enacted. So that seems like an interesting thing to me. And it seems to me it takes a different turn because at that time, like the contest was not like, oh, it's all decided already by the time, we get into the Middle Ages. It's like there was a contest about how much you should show and how much you should not, because you grew out of that. The second question I have about the whole period is like, and particularly from Plato's side, because if you put an emphasis on thinking about it and reading and all that and try to dialectically dissect it and criticize it, it seems like when you talk about human character, you're talking about the inner spirit. Are they in the beginning of developing psychology? I mean, particularly with Plato, if you're talking about the science of the inner, character, the inner psyche, put it that way. And why didn't the science of human character at birth and just sort of hinted at it, but it took such a long time, like till essentially David Hume almost, or you could say earlier Shakespeare, to develop that landscape in a fuller form. Because if that is the underlying driving force that allows you to, in a sense, surface and then experience nature in relationship to it, seems to me at least the beginning of that would have happened. Or maybe that was the beginning. So and it was sort of covered over by the Middle Ages. I'm not sure. Could you say something about that? Because that's such a key part of the inner nature versus the outer nature. That seems to me it would be. And it seems to me that the dramatists got it better in a way, because they actually showed the inner nature right there. I mean, like, yeah, he didn't even know that he was going to do all that stuff, and look, it did it. So that would be an interesting uncovering of what's happening there.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, your question's right on the money. This is exactly what I was going to talk about this opening structure here. He's talking about, says creatures of the natural order, right? So on the one hand, there is this sense that we are not authors of ourselves to begin with. We we find ourselves thrown into this situation, which means there's a huge element of pathos to our lived experience when we first become conscious or partially conscious. But of the natural order is what's interesting here, right? Because the medieval conception is that we're creatures of God. God created us. He's the creator and we're the creature. And that's where these terms get their real power ever since. But in this opening phrase, he's substituting God for the natural order. He's saying natural order is what created us from the ancient perspective. We're trying to understand the ancient worldview. And this is compatible with what we understood to be the difference between the ancient worldview, the medieval worldview, and the modern worldview in terms of the priorities of meaning, right? So in the ancient worldview, nature is above the gods and above man. Nature is the source of everything. And the gods are polytheistic because they represent the different kinds of authority that nature has over us. And so the gods are this active translation between the confusing but authoritative infinite of nature and the finiteness of a human mind trying to grapple with, oh my God, what do I have to do here? And the answer is, well, here's some things to pay attention to. And it's that he phrases it as creatures of the natural order is emphasizing the respect to which, even though you can find any number of ancient myths in which one god or another creates people, the truth is that if nature created the gods, then nature also created us. Then the gods were just mediators or midwives or the hands of nature anthropomorphized. You see that, you see the oddity. From a medieval perspective, it's a weird thing to not want your gods to be your creators. But, the most well-known creation myth is that Prometheus and Epimetheus created people. We molded us out of clay. Those aren't the gods. Those aren't the Olympian 12. Those are the Titans. Those are the older generation. From a medieval perspective, it's a weird thing to do to steal the authority from Zeus, who's supposed to be the king of the gods. We want him to be like, Jehovah. When we tell our myths, we're like, he's the Jehovah stand-in. But the Greeks were like, well, the Jehovah stand-in doesn't get to create humanity. He didn't do it. He didn't make us. From a medieval perspective, that's bizarre. I mean, in fact, it's heresy, right? God created everything. Why would you want a less powerful God? It's mysterious to us why the Greeks would do that. But the other critical element of the natural order to talk about here is remember Heraclitus's line about the nature around us and within us. This is the amphibious view of Homo sapiens, that we are a finite being who swims between two infinities, an infinity around us, which baffles and confuses us, but another infinity inside of our head, right? It says you couldn't discover the limits of the soul, not even if you search your entire life, such as its profundity. It is as infinite in here as it is out there. And this is another nature that has its own order, its own logos, its own rules that are unknown to us, but that determine how things flow and change and unfold over time. And so when he says as creatures of the natural order, implicit within this is the idea that both natures, which are actually the same nature wearing two different masks, both natures are creating us. Our character is generating our mind and our future character. And therefore, it's generating what it is that we will be conscious of versus unconscious of. It's generating the way that we look at a scene and miss some things and understand others. All of that's being generated. And therefore, it's generating our scope of decision making. Where are we free and where are we fated is being created. As part of our identity, that's all being created from the nature within us. Likewise, the nature around us, evolution, or the biological processes of embryogenesis, if we want to be more proximate, in our mother's womb, that physically created us and created the possibility for us to even have the inner nature that is likewise authoritative over us. So we're like twice created, right? Both physically and mentally. We're from the two infinities that encompass us as finite beings. And furthermore, unlike the Genesis God who said, let there be light, and there was, and that was it, there was light. the nature, the creative nature of the ancient world is relentlessly generating because it's also changing everything. So we're not only created once, but we're recreated every instant, a little different than we were a moment before. And all of this kind of recursive, iterative, incremental process of mutatis mutandis, the aliosis, the changing into another, is what's being captured here by this concept of creatures of the natural order, that we're being created by both of these things, by both of these forces at the same time. And what's hard for us to grok is that although, as Heraclitus says, the nature within us, our character, is like, has so much authority over our mind that it's like another god, like Zeus and Apollo and the rest. With our personal daimon is every bit as authoritative over our choices and what we're able to do. Nevertheless, that daimon is part of us, right? I mean, when we look at the relationship between ourself, the finite being, and the infinite nature around us, it's very easy to play self versus other, right? That is the other, and this is the self. And the boundary is my skin, right? And I can say, if something comes from outside and affects me inside, that's the other doing it to me. It's not my fault. And thus we get this line between agency and contingency, right? If I wanted to do it and I acted it out and it did, and I was successful, then we call that agency and we say that I'm free. But if I tried to act on it and something interfered with me, I was driving to the post office and I got into a car accident, everybody's fine, but I'm not going to make it on time, I missed the deadline, it's not my fault, that's contingency, right? The alien other did that to me and I don't want to take responsibility for it, right? In fact, I'm incapable of taking responsibility for most of the cosmos, so I'm never even going to go there outside of the planet Earth. I mean, I'm not even going to go to most places on Earth, let alone take responsibility for them. But, the Earth is this tiny speck in this enormous cosmos. I can't be held responsible for the Andromeda Galaxy. I mean, it's not my fault, right? Stop. What are you doing? Don't lay that on me, man. But it all gets messed up when we talk about the equally infinite nature inside of us. Because it's literally inside our skin, right? It may have authority over us like a god, like a daimon, determining our choices, or let's say framing the range of our choices in terms of what we're allowed to notice and not allowed to notice from one moment to the next. But we can't say something came from outside and interfered with what I was going to do, because it was inside us all along. We just couldn't see it. And so our inclination, like if you're an alcoholic, like I came out of an alcoholic family, the inclination is to say, well, yes, I've got the character of an alcoholic. I may not practice, but it's always there and it always wants me to, pick up a bottle and lose myself in it. It's ready at all times. It's nudging, okay, buddy, go pick up a bottle. And the issue there is that me or not me? Right? Am I responsible for that? Or am I not responsible for that? If it's like a god over me, then it has the authority, not me, and therefore I'm not responsible. That would seem to be the conclusion. Just like I'm not responsible for Mount St. Helens going off, right? That happened outside me, and it was beyond my control, and it had the kind of authority that the ancient Greeks called divine, right? Maybe it's Hephaestus, working in his forge, and his fires spew up and cause problems for mortals. That's not on me. So if the alcoholism inside of me is part of a daimon, because that's my character, my character's like a daimon, then how can I be responsible for that either? But on the other hand, it is in fact inside my skin, and it's right. In fact, it's not like in my finger or my foot that I could cut off and say, well, that's not me, or I could lose that part of me. It's inside my character. I can't even think about these problems without it being right there with me, which sure makes it seem like it's not an other. It makes it seem like it's a self. So the usual dichotomy between self and other that we use to define agency and contingency fate versus freedom and all those things is seriously screwed up when we apply it to the nature within us that is also co-creating us along with the nature outside of us, because it's right at the heart of where our identity lies. And yet somehow it has authority over us, which implies that it's not us, except it's inside us, which implies it is us. There is this, it's just rife with paradoxes. I think we've said a couple months ago, the more you look at the structure of nature, the more you see that just like you think you're walking on solid ground and the physicists say, no, it's almost all empty space. It's almost all electromagnetic repulsion between protons and electrons and bindings between atoms. Mostly you're hovering like a hovercraft walking over a vacuum in which there's a tiny number of particles relative to the vast amount of space involved. In the same way, the more you dig into the philosophy of nature and the structure of the cosmos, you realize that you're walking on paradoxes. Things only seem to be non-contradictory at a very shallow level of reality. But if you go much deeper than that, you run into paradoxes that seem to be the very structure of human character and also of the world around us. So as difficult as it is to say that we are creatures of the natural order when we're referring to the nature within us, to our own character, it gets even worse when we accept the fact that we have the potential, once we are aware of our character, to cultivate our character and modify it. Because now we're the authority over the authority, which is our character that it holds over us. It may be a god, but we can cultivate that god, which would seem to put us in charge, except that's not exactly right. So you get this complicated circle of interactions and dependencies that's all bound up in this opening sentence, creatures of the natural order. This is the ancient perspective, just taken for granted. If you are armed with this understanding of the ancient perspective on human character and human will, and you go back and you reread Aristotle and Heraclitus or Marcus Aurelius, any of them, you'll see it everywhere. Once you're keyed into it, once you understand that this is the way that they thought when they were writing, you realize there's any number of sentences that they write that we just habitually misinterpret. Because we have this caricaturizing, trivializing, flatland approach to answering questions about human nature and free will versus determinism. We think it's like the zero-dimensional thing. You either have free will, or it's deterministic, or our height of sophistication, we imagine some sort of spectrum between them, one-dimensional thinking, and we think that that's like, wow, so sophisticated. But none of it comes close to how sophisticated this ancient model of human nature is in terms of responsibility and so on. And thus we can read all this stuff and completely wildly misinterpret it because we're applying this caricaturing interpretation and assuming that they must have written what we would have written in their shoes, when nothing could be further from the truth. So this is what he's setting up in this sentence. And if it seems like, that's an awful lot to read into, what is that, 6 words? We remember this is section G. We've already been through sections A through F. They've set all this stuff up. We already went through all of the building blocks for this. And we should now be reading words like creatures and natural and order entirely differently than we would have before we got this far into this section. This is what Kenneth Smith is trying to do, is build up this vocabulary and this rich toolbox. and he'd shoot me for saying toolbox, but I'm going to use it just for the moment. Toolbox, right, of interpretive lenses that we can use to try to get out of the trap of the modernist worldview temporarily, long enough to look at the ancients the way they saw themselves. So Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I hate to seem like I'm always asking questions, but I guess I'm interested in learning. Your explanation seems to suggest there's a problem with the divided line. And I'm not going to pin that on Plato. I'm sort of using that almost incidentally, metaphorically, to hint at that, but not necessarily. Because if you look at the self as, like bounded by your skin, as an example, seemed very reasonable. There might be in that a mistake between the metaphysical and the physical world, because the body have a symbiotic relationship with things that are not part of us. Okay. I mean, are they part of us or are they not part of it? There seems to
That's
be a
right.
symbiotic relationship. They seem at the very least to be part of the supply chain.
Yes.
If you want to
Yes.
put it that way. Okay.
Yes.
So the physical nature does not draw the line, the divider line at
That's
that
right.
point. Okay.
That's right.
But the metaphysical does. So the metaphysical, is it the cause of what we would call over objectification, to the point that that's why it took so long for us to even begin to broach the issue of a ecological cycle? Because
Yes.
there's a seal, there's the water, there's the otter, there's a shark. I mean, like, okay. And so it, but
Yeah.
it seemed like yet the metaphysical seems like a reasonable place to begin, at least with the mind. Is that the problem? Not of being in the world, but being in the mind. But the mind is part of us, so it's just very confusing.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. And then this is why Gilbert Murray's final chapter in Five Stages of Greek Religion is called The Loss of Nerve.
Yeah.
He says, you know, up until that point in their history, the Greeks were perfectly willing to grapple with these issues and acknowledge that the world is very complicated and complex. And that every time we try to draw a line, like on the skin, and say inside the skin is us and outside the skin is it, their own science was, you know, as primitive as it was compared to us moderns, it was still sophisticated enough that they could tell, yeah, the water comes into us. It was other, but now it's self. You know, things are flowing through us. Panta re, you know, Plato paraphrases Heraclitus. The boundary between us is more of a permeable, penetrating, equivocating boundary in which things flow across that boundary every bit as much as they're repelled by it.
Yeah, but it seems to me, I mean, Plato does have the divider line, okay? So that may be his most exacting metaphor analogy, you know. But in a way, I think he was still loose enough to equivocate, whereas like metaphysics hardened in a sense after him. And so if that is to be blamed by our contemporary problem of over objectification of thingliness of things, then we might need to pin it on a later person. I don't know whether that should be Augustine or, you know, Aquinas or whoever, but because I think he was living at a point when it was certainly in contention. It wasn't like Plato said it all, you know, go away, Aristotle. Actually, Aristotle did go away. So that's kind of funny. I mean, Aristotle maybe should have been the next director of the academy, but nonetheless, go away because, you know, you don't quite fit our structure or something. So it 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 just seemed like a very decisive moment that, you know, to take it seriously enough without taking it so seriously that that becomes the structure of everything else. I'm not sure, you know, it's like, yeah, I tend to equivocate. And I like the idea you say, you know, we did not begin with a creation myth. I mean, the Greeks did not. I shouldn't say we. Greek did not. They're thrown into the world, they're trying to figure it out. That really reminds me of Heidegger's thrown us into being,
Yes.
right? It
Yes.
really, really does.
Well, he's a classicist, right? It makes sense that
That's right.
he's on that.
You're thrown into being and you're trying to figure it out. You know, you're trying to figure out it's very difficult. And so, yeah, I think we are all thrown. And in some sense, when you're a child, you're thrown into the system and it doesn't quite make sense. You're slowly trying to figure it out. and almost in many ways, and as you were talking too, it seems like there's nature, there's the God, the kind of the mediator, and 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 those human beings. It seems like the gods were an early form of the symbolic order that turned into the linguistic order. Yeah.
Yeah.
So symbolic order that became the linguistic order. And I think once you got into the linguistic order, then it becomes much more concrete, objectifying, like because there's actually a word, right? Ooh, yeah. That's a very, very interesting thought. Because we are certainly, as modern human beings, we very much want to exist in the existential order, but we have to live also very much in the symbolic order. I mean, and the linguistic order. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we can't do without noesis. We can't survive without it. And it needs fuel. And instead of food, what it consumes is symbols and abstractions. It needs them.
Well, not only that, but society has gotten so complicated that when you say, like we are escapists because we don't want to think. You just need to know where the bus station is, the train station, and the rest is for you. Don't we, in a complex world, need to, in a sense, a lot of non-thinking? I mean, otherwise, like, could you imagine you're in the train, and sometimes you are really excited by the landscape, but could you imagine thinking about riding in the train every moment? You can't think about anything else. Like, yeah, the thing is to get over there and do the real thing, which is call your labor of work. So, I mean, I think we're kind of trapped in the system, and so when I drive in the freeway, yeah, I do some thinking, but most of the time the freeway is thinking for me. Unless I want to intentionally say, oh, I got to stop by this, diner, or I got to go off-road and visit nature or something, like I have to intentionally struggle because the road almost seems to drive itself.
It does.
Sometimes I almost test it. I don't take that too seriously. Like I take my hand off the steering wheel, it seems move by itself, I just have to like gently go like this. Like,
That's great.
yeah.
So easy. Just follow the road.
Yeah, right. Yeah, automatic. Automatism. Okay, that's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Stefan, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, sorry, Harlan's got one. I'm sorry, my son was just trying to ask me something right as I came off mute. On the topic of nature and whatnot, and versus the dichotomy between fate and free will and whatnot, a lot of the musings and philosophy that was in contemplation that was done was trying to understand the nature of nature. That it is not necessarily fate is our nature. That is, we have aspects of ourselves that are limited by our nature. We are human. We are carbon-based life forms. We don't have chlorophyll. We can't just live off water and sunlight. We have to eat. We have predispositions or necessities to be social creatures, to reproduce sexually, to have to get out of an agrarian lifestyle, whenever to where we have specialization in trade and whatnot, and that is a necessity. It's like there's a point where we do not have the ability to determine that we can live off water and sunlight. There's one that's our nature. There are aspects of our inner selves that, as much as we say, well, we don't have free will because we can't change them. Well, I can't change gravity just because I will it. That's science fiction fantasy there. So that is a great large aspect of what this exploration has been for millennia. And when you're talking about the gods and the shift to the linguistic approach, from the if for a more modern perspective, or relatively, it's dated now, but Carl Jung had a lot of exploration in this area with the archetypes and symbolic man and his symbols, and just in looking at trying to decipher or contextualize the subconscious and figure out what was natural and what was personal and individual. So, and to figure out where we lie. And I've had a lot of joy in exploring some of his works, even though some of it doesn't fit very well or hasn't aged as well when it comes to gender and some of the other aspects. It's been very influential to our society and psychology, and it's something I don't think we could get into right now with this, but it's definitely referential and would commend it to anyone to take a look at it at some time. So,
Thanks, Stefan.
I'm trying to get back to muting myself here. I
Sure.
accidentally.
Oh, I can do that. Oops, sorry. So yeah, so we've mentioned before, and it's worth bringing up again. Kenneth Smith says that he didn't get to read a lot of Carl Jung because Carl Jung wasn't in when the paperback revolution came, and it was the paperback revolution that made so many philosophy and sociology books cheap for Kenneth when he was a college student. And so he's really steeped in the sociologists and in the philosophers. And he says Freud, there were paperback editions of Freud was really in the 60s. But Jung was out. He was mostly only available in hardback until later. And as a result, you won't find a lot of Jung directly cited in Kenneth Smith's philosophy. But he says, as he keeps being reminded by his students, there's a lot of Jung you can bring to Kenneth Smith and use to supplement him that doesn't actually distort his philosophy in any way. It's very compatible. There's a lot of interesting stuff there, like you're pointing out, that could be explored. But you got to know you're going to be you need to be the one to bring it. Just like I bring a lot of evolutionary science and add that, or Christopher Alexander's works on architecture and natural design. Now I bring that to Kenneth Smith. It's not intrinsically in there, but because Kenneth Smith is really digging into the kind of ancient organic worldview, you find it compatible with every other thinker that has been working on bringing the natural organic worldview to bear, whether it's Christopher Alexander or Carl Jung or whoever. And you get very interesting discussions that come out of that because you're finding synergy rather than distortion with things that he never included, but he could have easily, because it's coming at the problem from another angle. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Today's discussion has been very interesting as I listened to us question the uncertainty that governs our existence. And I want to take us back to the text here, the first sentence, which is a completion of the couple of the sentence that you read, where you said, as creatures of the natural order, humans cannot escape the palette of subjective resources they have been endowed with. And then he pauses. Ultimately, we think as we have habituated ourselves to live. And I like the word habituated there, because habituated means that we're constantly transitioning to a new state of being. And that, I think, is the essence of it all. I'm done.
Yeah, I love that, Sharon. Thank you. That's right. That's where he's taking us here, and the journey from where we are to that passes through a couple of things. And one of them is when he says humans cannot escape the palette of subjective resources they've been endowed with. That they have been endowed with is reinforcing that we're creatures of ourselves before we are creators of ourselves. That long before we become conscious enough to start self-molding, we have already been molded and endowed with certain things. Also, endowed with is a reference to Declaration of Independence, isn't it? I mean, you can't bring that phrase up without certain inalienable rights, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he's certainly making that reference. For Stefan's benefit, Kenneth is he's not just difficult to read because he uses a big vocabulary, and he's not just difficult to read because he has redefined all of the terms in that vocabulary in terms of the history of existentialist philosophy. He's also difficult to read because he writes carefully, and he edits and edits and edits before he publishes. And he's always trying to follow Nietzsche's dictum It's my goal to say in 10 sentences what other people say in a book, what other people don't say in a book. Says Nietzsche, and he's in that Nietzsche is aspiring to Heraclitus and other pre-classical philosophers who used to try to find these just really tight little phrases and clauses that are pregnant with meaning, like know thyself. So there's times when Kenneth writes more informally, and there's times when he writes more formally, and you kind of got to feel your way through which one he's doing at any given moment. But in these installments, he was able to write for the Comics Journal and End Times. He had plenty of time to go through and tune. Now he might, if you asked him about it today, he might say, "Oh God, I would rewrite all that stuff now if I had a chance." He wanted to tune it further, but that's just the evidence. He already was tuning a whole bunch, and he still has the knee-jerk instinct to go in and tinker with it some more and tune it up. So when you spot a phrase like endowed with, they have been endowed with, and you think to yourself, I wonder if that's related to certain inalienable rights. Yeah, you bet it is. I mean, he probably wrote something else first and then thought of that phrase and the allusion that's built into it to draw in that whole host of other issues. And he replaced the original text with that phrase. He does the same thing when he's talking about creatures of the natural order. He may or may not have thought of that as his first draft. And then he thought, how can I compress this more? How can I turn a paragraph into the opening of just a sentence? So all of this stuff, it's always heavily charged with allusion. So there's that thing about subjective resources they've been endowed with, and basically what he's doing here is he's slapping Thomas Jefferson around a little bit, because Thomas Jefferson says we've been endowed with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But Kenneth Smith is saying, an ancient would say, far more important than any of those things is that you have been endowed with character, and that character is authoritative over you. And to ignore the presence of character and focus on these desideratum, the things we want to have, and not on the real authority, is to set yourself up for failure from an ancient perspective.
But I think he supports that word endowed with habituating, because the character is not constant.
Yes, exactly.
It's constantly evolving.
Exactly.
And that, I think, is the magic of that whole sentence.
I agree completely.
Right?
I agree.
So there's complexity, there's uncertainty, but it's all part of the process.
That's right.
That we go through. And whether we look to a monotheistic God or a polytheistic God to govern the decisions and the choices that we made, it is still an evolutionary process.
That's right.
And probably the only thing that we have is the free will or the choice.
That's right.
Right? And so complexity does not necessarily infer difficulty.
Exactly.
Or impossibility.
Exactly.
It just means that it's a challenge.
That's right. It's what's so rich about this sentence. I'm so glad that you took us to the end of it the way you did. I mean, that there's a reason he ends with the part that you just highlighted. It's like the modern perspective wants to be either we have free will, or we are fated. And those are the only options. And he says the ancient perspective is that we are fated, except that we are fated by our own character, and our character grows and changes, which means what our fate is changes over time. At any given instant, we might say, well, this is our fate. But in the next instant, we might have, through how we live, changed what we're habituated to, thereby altered our character, and thereby altered our fate. It's this really interesting, evolving relationship between free will and determinism. And that was just the natural perspective that the ancients had that we don't have in the modern world. There's this sophisticated worldview captured he summarized it here in this sentence.
Yes.
It's so easy to read this and miss most of it, but I think it's one of his best sentences. It captures so much of what's interesting about the ancient worldview in one sentence.
Well, it also sets up, I think, the rest of the paragraph, because Phil talked about the physical and the metaphysical. but they both are subjected to that habituating process.
That's
I mean,
right.
we just look at ourselves. We're getting old. That's the physical.
That's right.
We're changing, right? And
Yeah.
our experiences allow us to modify the way we think.
That's right. That's right. I mean,
That's all.
if I, for a while in high school, I paid my rent for my little trailer I lived in, which was plugged into my mom's house. I paid my rent to our landlord by going out every morning and feeding his cattle. And he taught me how to drive a truck so that I could drive the truck up to where the hay bales were stored under a shelter. And we get the hooks out and we, grab the hay bales and throw them onto the back of the truck and cut the cords so that we could loosen them. And then I'd drive slowly across this big field. The cattle would all come running, and I'd push a bale off and then drive a little further and push a bale off. So there's a lot of different feeding stations spread out across the field. But the step before that, where I'm using the hooks and I'm hauling these great big bales of hay onto the back of a truck, that was the way I was living. And the habituation changed my body. I mean, I developed more strength than I had when I moved in because I just had to, because they were heavy, right? So there is a way in which the habituation is changing my capabilities physically, which is therefore changing my fatedness. There are now things that I could do at the end of, 3 years of living there that I couldn't have done when I first moved in, just because of my body. So that's the nature around us. That's the external. And then by the same token, like you're saying, there's this habituation works internally as well. So our character is changing at the same time our body's changing. And I'm now in the habit of, I don't wake up shortly before school and race through a shower and race to make my lunch so I can get in the car in time to be driven to school. Now, instead, I'm getting up, an hour before it's time to go to school, because I got to go get out into the field and feed those cattle. And slowly over the course of 3 years, I'm changing from an afternoon person to a morning person. My character has altered. That's not my muscles, right? That's the nature within me that is endowing me with new resources because I'm changing the way that I live. So there's very interesting feedback loops involved here in this relationship between free will and determinism from the ancient perspective. I think it's a incredibly rich model.
But that's the magical essence of it. And I took some time to read this weekend the different philosophical interpretations of character. Yeah. Aristotle, Hume, Kant, and that again is part of the habituation process.
That's right.
Because it's all very different.
That's right.
And these different character evolutions is what creates a society and what creates diversity within a society, which is part of the essence again. Okay, I think I've said enough for one day.
Great stuff, Sharon. Thank you. And core to this, like you're saying, is there's this Hegelian idea that the relationship between a human personality or character and the society around them isn't as simple as self versus other, which a lot of moderns think that it is, right? Society tries to oppress me and I must resist and be an individual. Well, that's all well and good, but as Hegel argues, our characters in action over time change and generate the culture that then in turn is affecting the way that we raise the next generation of kids. And so if you get a whole bunch of hyper intellectuals making a culture over time, the culture will gradually shed its non-rational qualities in favor of becoming more legalistic and structured and abstract in order to satisfy the noesis of the hyper intellectual. So the people, through the acting of their character, are changing the culture, and then the culture in turn is changing the next generation of people. So again, you've got another feedback loop involved. And Hegel gets all that from the Greeks.
And that's the one that I'm trying to figure out, because I think that cultures have definite characteristics.
Yes.
Those characteristics are also evolutionary.
Exactly.
Just as the Greeks did it. So I think everybody else, all the other citizens, was involved in that same process.
That's right. That's right. This is definitely the existentialist interpretation of how this stuff works.
Yes.
Where did we begin? I mean, early in chapter 4, we were talking about how the Greeks don't conceive of a universe made up of things, They conceive of a universe made up of organisms. And even things that we think of as things, they see as organisms. They say they have their own processes of change, which means each thing is an organism to the extent to which it has its own nature, which is its own character, which affects what it can and can't do. And in all those things, the character is also changing over time. So if that's true of me as a person, it's also true of my culture. It has its own nature, its own character. And as it acts as a culture, the habituation to the way that it lives changes the culture over time. So, with this one simple model that has this feedback loop built into it, all of a sudden, the relationships between us and the cosmos around us become really rich.
Yes.
We were able to explain so much more using this organismic model, than we were able to do when we tried to reduce everything to Legos or gears in a machine. This is light years beyond Newton, in terms of its ability to describe how and why things change.
So one last thing, the next sentence, he tries to support it by, he says, Kafka's America offered the notion that anyone could be an artist. And I kind of got a little lost in that as I was reading ahead. So next time you'll talk about Kafka's America and how it applies to this habituating process and how it supports the first sentence.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. We'll talk about that next time. This time it was all we could do to get through the first sentence because it's so rich. It's just such a rich sentence. Thanks, Sharon. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind, and then we'll wrap up. You get the final comments for today.
Yeah, well, I was in a small group after some meetings. There were a few Americans there. This was an Australian group, but there were a few Americans there, and I was listening to the people just talk around, and they were so preoccupied with ideas like wouldn't it be nice to have a universal basic income? And, I wouldn't have to get up out of the bed in the morning and stuff like that. And you listen to all that, and not that I'm not that myself. I've spent plenty of years being the person that didn't want to get up out of bed in the morning. I recognise that in myself, and I realise I'm listening to a committee of slaves. And it's true, I've been mainly the slave class most of my life, and it's the tragedy is that they won't aspire to anything more than a more comfortable condition of slavery. And that's where go on, Sharon.
Because I really disagree with that, because I think a universal basic income is meant to be supplementary and not replacement. And so the slavery escapes me, and if you got a universal basic income, it doesn't mean you're going to stay in your bed all day.
It's the people who don't want it to be a supplement. It's the people who want it to be a replacement that Stephen's referring to. And there are people like that. I've heard those people too.
Well, then the level of the income should not be that high to be a replacement. You see, the system design needs to be evaluated then.
Yeah. But
well,
that augments the slavery mentality that he's talking about.
It does.
Produces that.
Right.
Oh, look, I don't mind the fact that most people, we're born as slaves in a small sense because we're children. We have to follow a parent.
Yes.
And the vast majority of people, and I think this is the indication in society, you look at these ancient societies, and what did the leadership call most of the people? They called them the children, because the aristocrats were those who had gone a bit further. And the vast majority of the population really just wanted to follow somebody else. They don't really want to make the effort of thinking for themselves, which is cool. I know most people might be in a condition where they more or less have to live in that condition and work for a wage And that's fine. But the thing is, maybe you can aspire, so even think about being something a little bit more. And I think that's what bothers me, is that you have a whole gang of people who can't imagine a condition better than a more comfortable slavery, which is fine. Go on, Sharon. Yeah.
I just want to say something, though, because, I think I hear this a lot. In any system, there is never going to be complete uniformity. So you're always going to have people who will optimize and people who will be sluggards. But it doesn't mean that the system should not exist. Right? Because because what you're hoping for is that the majority of people will optimize it. And those that don't, that will fall by the way. And those are the ones you're talking about. Those are the sluggards. And in my own world, I can tell you, a guy comes in and he smokes 3 packs of cigarettes a day. And, I may say, well, that's not such a good idea. Right? But this is his choice and this is his life. And the day he comes back and he's got a lesion on his lung.
That's his crutch as well.
Exactly. But the day he comes back and he's got a big lesion on his lung, then the whole process stops. He's done with it. I don't have to talk to him about, abstaining and giving it up. He just does it. So what I'm saying is that, and we come right back to this character issue and the habituating and the variety. This is where we are. People make choices based on the life they want to lead. And is it nature or is it nurture? And the whole thing, I think, is intertwined and it's not complex. It's just the way we want to be while we're here. That's the way I see it.
It's interesting.
I'll better leave it there.
Yeah, and thank you, Stefan, and thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Sharon. Stefan wants to add one last comment before we go out the door. So go ahead, Stefan, come off mute and add it in there, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, just to respond to something she said was, something that I have come to understand is that any closed system requires an imbalance of energy or resources in order for activity to occur. Weather is a perfect example for this. If we didn't have imbalances in air masses for humidity and energy and temperature, we wouldn't have activity. Same thing with economics. If everyone had this, requires someone to have something and not. It's the problems become with when the imbalances have greater severity, the actions and reactions become much more drastic and catastrophic. Or substantial, just like weather and just like in economics, you'll see it there. You cannot have a completely equitable system. There's always going to be inequity if you want something to happen. That's because of basic entropy. Entropy can be seen in sociological, psychological, and physical activity. So that's all I want to say.
That's the scientific explanation.
And on that note, let's wrap up for this week, and we'll pick this up again next week.
I know I didn't say anything, and thank you, Rick, and thank you, Sharon. She saved me again. I don't know why I'm having so much problem trying to get into your meeting on Mondays, Rick. But,
well, you can always email me. I keep it open just in case you send me a message.
I know I sent you an email, but I guess you were too busy hosting.
Yeah, because it had started. Okay.
Yeah,
well,
thank you for having me. Nice to meet everyone.
Our pleasure.
Okay, thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Rick,
Bye.
again. Bye, David. Bye.